Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the southern plains of Mesopotamia, somewhere around 4500 BCE, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers spread their fingers across the floodplain like veins carrying life itself into an otherwise unforgiving landscape. The air here is thick with moisture from the marshlands, heavy with the scent of reed and silt, and if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the soft lapping of water against mudbanks, the distant call of herons, the whisper of wind through papyrus. Stands that tower twice as tall as a person. This is the cradle, they say, the birthplace of civilization, though whether civilization is something to celebrate or mourn is a question we'll leave for philosophers who get better sleep than we do. The Sumerians who settled here didn't arrive with fanfare or grand proclamations. They simply appeared in the archaeological record like characters in a story whose first chapter has been torn out, already knowing how to irrigate fields, already pressing marks into wet clay, already organizing themselves into something resembling cities when most of humanity was still figuring out the finer points of not starving. The temple at Eridu stands before us now in your mind's eye, not as the crumbling foundation it is today, but as it might have been in its earliest form, a modest platform of mud brick rising from the marsh, barely distinguishable from the landscape except for its geometric precision, its corners aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that suggests either careful observation or divine instruction, depending on which scholar you ask and how much coffee they've had. Inside this temple, in the cool darkness that smells of lamp oil and incense made from resins carried hundreds of miles by traders whose names are lost to time, priests in linen robes move with practiced efficiency, tending to the statue of Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom, who presides over this particular patch of cosmic real estate. Now, before we go any further, I should mention that you probably won't survive this journey. Not literally, of course. You'll wake up tomorrow perfectly fine, maybe a bit groggy, possibly confused about why you dreamed about ancient grain storage techniques, but your sense of human history as a simple upward climb from ignorance to enlightenment that might not make it through the night. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not interested in pity subscriptions or algorithmic charity. If you find value in falling asleep to discussions of ancient astronaut theories delivered with the enthusiasm of a sedated sloth, then by all means, click that button. While you're at it, why don't you leave a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is as you listen to this? There's something oddly comforting about imagining all of you scattered across the globe, in different time zones, some of you watching the sunset while others watch it rise, all of us connected by the shared experience of using ancient history as a sleep aid, which is probably not what the Sumerians had in mind when they invented writing, but would almost certainly amuse them. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The mainstream historical fact we need to establish right from the start is that the Sumerians developed the world's first writing system, cuneiform, around 3400 BCE, initially as a method for keeping track of economic transactions, specifically who owned how many sheep, how much barley was stored in which granary, and who owed what to whom, because apparently even in paradise, somebody had to do the accounting. These weren't letters in the way we think of them. Early cuneiform wasn't phonetic but pictographic, little drawings pressed into clay with a reed stylus, and if you examine the oldest tablets closely, you can see the evolution from actual pictures to increasingly abstract symbols, as if the scribes gradually realized that drawing a realistic sheep every single time they needed to record a sheep was tedious beyond description and decided that a few strategic wedge marks would do just fine. Thank you very much. The tablets themselves are marvels of accidental preservation. Clay, when dried or baked, becomes nearly indestructible, surviving fires that would consume papyrus or parchment, lasting through floods, warfare, the collapse of empires, the rise of new religions, the invention of the printing press, and somehow ending up in climate-controlled museum storage where they're photographed and catalogued and occasionally brought out for special exhibitions where people pay admission fees to look at ancient shopping lists. The earliest tablets are small, roughly the size of a smartphone, which is a comparison that will date this script terribly in about 10 years but seems apt right now, and they're covered in neat columns of wedge-shaped impressions that record transactions so mundane they're almost meditative. 5 sheep received, 3 sheep dispersed, 2 sheep unaccounted for, and presumably off having their own adventures in the marshland. This, the scholars tell us with the confidence of people who have dedicated their entire professional lives to reading receipts from 5,000 years ago, is how writing began, not with poetry or prayer or declarations of love, but with bureaucracy, with the fundamentally human need to remember who owes us money and to make sure everyone else remembers it too. The city-states that emerged in Sumer, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, Nippur, were organized around these temples, which functioned not just as religious centers but as economic engines, massive operations that owned land, employed workers, stored grain, distributed rations, and generally ran the show, while the gods theoretically provided legitimacy and protection from the various catastrophes that could befall an agricultural society in a floodplain where the rivers changed course on a whim and drought or deluge could arrive without warning. The temple complex at Uruk, which by 3000 BCE had become the largest city in the world, with a population somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people, numbers that seem modest now but were absolutely staggering for a time when most humans lived in groups of a few hundred at most, covered hundreds of acres and included granaries, workshops, administrative buildings, and the famous Anu Ziggurat, a stepped pyramid that rose in graduated platforms toward the sky, each level painted a different color so that from a distance it looked like a geometric rainbow or possibly a very ambitious layer cake. The joke among archaeologists, delivered with the dry humor that comes from spending too much time in the desert's sun, is that the Sumerians invented civilization and then immediately invented middle management to run it, which gives you some sense of just how quickly things escalated from "let's plant some barley" to "we need 14 different administrative departments and a standardized system of weights and measures." Now, here's where things get interesting, or at least where they get weird, which in the context of bedtime history is essentially the same thing. There exists a fringe interpretation of these earliest Sumerian texts, championed most famously by Zechariah Sitchin and enthusiastically embraced by people who find mainstream archaeology insufficiently exciting, which suggests that the Sumerian gods, the Anunnaki as they're collectively known, were not mythological constructs or personifications of natural forces but actual extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold, which they needed to repair their planet's atmosphere because apparently even advanced alien civilizations have environmental problems and insufficient carbon taxes. According to this interpretation, the Anunnaki created humans through genetic engineering, mixing their own DNA with that of Homo erectus, specifically to create a worker race capable of doing the mining while they supervised from a comfortable distance, which is either the most elaborate just so story ever conceived or a shockingly accurate account of our origins, depending entirely on how much credibility you assign to translations that most Sumerian scholars insist are wildly inaccurate if not outright fabricated. Sitchin, who died in 2010 after a long career of making Mesopotamian scholars tear their hair out in frustration, claimed to have read cuneiform, though actual cuneiform scholars point out that reading cuneiform is not like reading modern languages. It's more like solving a crossword puzzle written in 3 different languages simultaneously, where the same symbol can represent a sound, a word, or a concept depending on context, and where puns and wordplay are so common that sometimes even the ancient scribes left notes in the margins, essentially saying, "This is a joke, by the way, in case future readers don't get it," which is both hilarious and poignant. The specific tablets Sitchin focused on include the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that describes how the god Marduk created the world by splitting the body of the chaos goddess Tiamat in half like a cosmic geode, and the Atrahasis, which contains the Mesopotamian flood narrative that predates and probably inspired the biblical account of Noah, though the Sumerian flood hero is named Ziusudra, which doesn't have quite the same ring to it and possibly explains why later editors went with Noah instead. In Sitchin's reading, every reference to gods descending from heaven is actually a description of spacecraft landing. Every mention of the god's radiance or terrible appearance is radiation or advanced technology, and every ancient monument aligned with the stars is evidence of astronomical knowledge that could only have been provided by beings who actually traveled between those stars, which is a compelling narrative if you're willing to overlook the fact that humans throughout history have been perfectly capable of observing the sky, noting patterns, and building accordingly without any extraterrestrial assistance. The Anunnaki, in this telling, are led by Anu, whose name means sky, and who remains mostly in orbit or on Nibiru, their home planet, which supposedly follows a 3,600-year elliptical orbit around our Sun, swooping in periodically like a cosmic tourist bus, though astronomers point out that such an orbit would be gravitationally unstable and that no evidence of such a planet exists, despite increasingly sophisticated surveys of the outer solar system that can detect objects far smaller and more distant than a planet-sized body in our own cosmic neighborhood. The joke here, and I promised you jokes, so here's one, is that Sitchin's theories require you to believe that ancient aliens were simultaneously advanced enough to traverse interstellar space and genetically engineer new species, but somehow not advanced enough to mine gold using robots or automation, instead opting for the biological workforce solution, which suggests either a remarkable attachment to tradition or a severe lack of imagination for beings who supposedly mastered faster-than-light travel. The scholarly debate surrounding these interpretations is less a debate than a one-sided shouting match, with mainstream academics on one side insisting that Sitchin couldn't read Sumerian properly and that his translations are often completely fabricated, while a small but enthusiastic segment of the population on the other side insists that academia is too hidebound and dogmatic to consider alternative theories, which is a criticism that has some merit in general but probably doesn't apply to a field where people spend decades arguing over the correct translation of individual symbols and are thrilled to overturn previous interpretations if the evidence supports it. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Semitic languages who devoted considerable energy to debunking Sitchin's claims before his own death in 2022, wrote extensively about how Sitchin's methodology involved cherry-picking passages, ignoring context, and sometimes simply mistranslating words in ways that supported his thesis while being completely unjustifiable from a linguistic standpoint. For instance, the Sumerian word Anunnaki literally means something like those of the princely seed or offspring of the prince, where the prince in question is probably Anu, the sky god, which in the context of Mesopotamian religion is a perfectly straightforward way of saying the major gods, but Sitchin translated it as those who from heaven to earth came, which requires you to interpret multiple words in ways that no other Sumerian text supports, and to add several words that aren't actually present in the original language, which is less translation than creative writing. The debate, such as it is, highlights a fundamental tension in how we approach ancient texts. Do we privilege the literal reading, assuming that ancient people meant exactly what they said and described things as they saw them, even when what they claim to have seen seems impossible by our current understanding of physics? Or do we assume that ancient people, like modern people, used metaphor, exaggeration, and symbolic language to convey meaning, and that taking everything literally is a fundamental misunderstanding of how human communication works? The answer, frustratingly, is probably both, depending on context, which is the kind of nuanced position that doesn't make for exciting television documentaries or viral YouTube videos but is almost certainly closer to the truth than any extreme position. When a Sumerian text says that the god Enlil came down from the sky in a boat of heaven, does that mean a spacecraft, a metaphor for a storm, a misremembered account of someone important arriving by riverboat that got mythologized over generations, all of the above, none of the above? The honest answer is that we don't know, can't know without a time machine, or at minimum some much more detailed contextual evidence than we possess, and that certainty in either direction, whether absolute rejection or absolute acceptance, is probably misplaced. Here's another joke, because we're running low on our quota and I can feel you drifting off, which is exactly what should be happening but means I need to work faster. The scholarly consensus is that Sumerian civilization developed gradually over thousands of years through a combination of environmental pressure, social organization, technological innovation, and probably a fair amount of trial and error, which is the historical equivalent of saying it's complicated and then refusing to elaborate, but is almost certainly more accurate than aliens did it, though admittedly less fun at parties. The sensory experience of walking through ancient Uruk in its prime, around 3000 BCE, would be overwhelming to modern senses unused to cities without internal combustion engines. The smell hits you first. Bread baking in clay ovens, beer fermenting in massive ceramic jars, the yeasty sweetness of grain stores, the acrid tang of copper being smelted, the organic musk of livestock, the herbal sharpness of various oils and unguents, the smoke from cooking fires and incense, and underlying it all, the earthy scent of the river and the wet clay that is Sumer's primary building material, its most abundant resource, the substance from which bricks are made, pots are formed, tablets are inscribed, and which, when the rains come, turns the streets into slick channels of mud that grab at your sandals and squelch between your toes. The sound is a constant layered hum, people haggling in the markets, children laughing or crying or playing games whose rules are lost to us, animals bleating and lowing and clucking, the rhythmic thud of looms weaving cloth, the musical ring of copper being hammered, the soft shuffling of feet on packed earth or stone pavement, the splash of water being poured from ceramic vessels, the chanting of priests in the temple, voices raised in prayer or song, or simply calling out to neighbors across narrow streets. The visual landscape is dominated by mud brick architecture in shades of tan and brown and ochre, occasionally broken by the brilliant white of gypsum plaster or the vivid colors of painted facades, reds and blues made from imported minerals, blacks from charcoal, yellows from ochre, and everywhere the geometric precision of Sumerian aesthetics, right angles and clean lines and stepped platforms rising toward the sky. The ziggurat dominates the skyline, visible from miles away across the flat plain, its levels painted in bands of color that catch the harsh Mesopotamian sun and glow like something from another world, which, if you believe Sitchin, is exactly what it's meant to be. A landing platform or residence for beings from another world, though mainstream archaeology suggests it's a symbolic mountain, a recreation of the highland landscape from which the Sumerians may have originally migrated, a way of bringing the sacred geography of the homeland into the flat alluvial plain where nothing naturally rises above the horizon. The people themselves are shorter than modern humans, averaging perhaps 5 feet to 5.5 feet tall, though whether this is genetics or nutrition is debated, dressed in wool garments, skirts for both men and women, with the wealthy adding fringed or decorated shawls, and the very wealthy adding gold jewelry, necklaces and bracelets and elaborate headdresses that signal status as clearly as any modern designer label. They move with purpose through streets that are planned, at least in the temple district, following a grid pattern that speaks to central organization, though the residential areas sprawl more organically, houses built against houses, sharing walls, creating a labyrinth of narrow alleys and dead-end courtyards where extended families live in multi-generational clusters that blur the line between private and communal space. The technology these people possess is Bronze Age, which means they're working with copper and tin alloys that allow for harder tools and weapons than pure copper, though bronze itself is expensive because tin has to be imported from distant sources, possibly Afghanistan or Anatolia, requiring trade networks that stretch for thousands of miles and involve multiple intermediary cultures, each taking their cut, each adding their markup, so that a bronze dagger in Uruk contains not just metal, but the accumulated labor and risk of dozens of people across dozens of cultures, a globalized economy in miniature. The wheel has been invented perhaps in Sumer itself, though this is disputed, and is used primarily for pottery, the potter's wheel, which allows for the rapid production of standardized ceramics that will become one of archaeology's most useful tools for dating sites because pottery styles change rapidly and shatter frequently, leaving convenient stratigraphic markers throughout the ancient world. Wheeled vehicles exist but are rare, expensive, awkward things, solid wheels rather than spoked, heavy and slow and mostly used for ceremonial purposes or for transporting impossibly heavy loads the short distances from river to warehouse, because roads in the modern sense don't exist and the terrain between cities is still largely marsh or desert, more easily traversed by boat or foot than by cart. The plough has revolutionized agriculture, allowing farmers to till more land more quickly, though at the cost of significant labor from draft animals, usually oxen, which must be fed and maintained and which represent a substantial capital investment that not every farmer can afford, creating economic stratification between those who own oxen and those who must rent them or rely on human labor alone. Irrigation is the foundation of everything, the technology that makes civilization possible in this particular location, a complex network of canals and dikes and water gates that requires constant maintenance, collective organization, and probably some form of centralized authority to adjudicate disputes over water rights, which may be how the temple gains its economic and political power. Not through military conquest or religious fervor alone, but through the simple fact that someone needs to manage the water, and whoever manages the water controls the food supply, and whoever controls the food supply controls everything else by default. The joke here, number 7 or 8, I'm losing count, which is ironic given that we're discussing the civilization that invented counting, is that Sumerian civilization runs on barley and bureaucracy, the grain providing calories and beer, the bureaucracy ensuring that everyone knows exactly who owns which calories and beer, and together they create a system stable enough to support scribes and priests and artisans and all the other specialized roles that aren't directly involved in food production, but which make urban civilization possible, or at least make it more interesting than just farming indefinitely. The question of where the Sumerians came from is one of archaeology's persistent mysteries, the kind of question that generates academic papers and conference presentations and occasional arguments that get awkwardly tense over dinner at symposiums. They don't seem to be Semitic, linguistically speaking, which distinguishes them from their neighbors and successors in Mesopotamia, the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, all of whom speak languages from the Semitic family tree. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate, unrelated to any other known language, a linguistic island in a sea of Semitic and later Indo-European languages, which might mean they were indigenous to southern Mesopotamia since time immemorial, or might mean they arrived from elsewhere so long ago that their linguistic cousins, if they had any, have disappeared without trace. The physical anthropology doesn't help much. Sumerian skulls and skeletons show no significant differences from other populations in the region, suggesting either long-term genetic mixing or that they were always part of the same general population that spread across the ancient Near East after the last ice age. Their art depicts people with large eyes and prominent noses, but this is stylistic convention, not necessarily realistic portraiture, and shouldn't be used to draw conclusions about their actual appearance any more than we should assume that Egyptian pharaohs actually had sideways faces because that's how they're shown in profile paintings. The cultural elements that mark them as distinctly Sumerian, the cuneiform writing, the specific pantheon of gods, the architectural styles, the particular forms of social organization, appear in the archaeological record suddenly, or at least suddenly by archaeological standards, which means over the course of a few centuries rather than gradually over millennia, and this has led to speculation that they arrived as a fully formed culture from elsewhere, though where this elsewhere might be, and why we have no evidence of them in that elsewhere, is left conveniently vague. The alternative explanation, less dramatic but more scientifically supported, is that the transition from prehistoric villages to urban civilization happened locally, driven by environmental changes, technological innovations like irrigation, and social developments like specialized labor and centralized storage, and that what looks like a sudden appearance is actually our inability to trace the gradual development because earlier sites are buried under meters of silt or destroyed by millennia of agriculture and urbanization. The joke, and this is genuinely funny if you've spent enough time thinking about archaeological methodology to have developed a dark sense of humor about it, is that we're arguing over the origins of a civilization based on a sample size that probably represents less than 1% of 1% of what originally existed, and that any conclusions we draw are provisional at best, wild speculation at worst, and absolutely certain to be revised in the next 20 years when someone finds a new cache of tablets or identifies a previously unknown site or develops a new analytical technique that overturns everything we thought we knew, which is why archaeologists as a group tend to be both confident and humble, certain of their interpretations of the available evidence, while simultaneously aware that the available evidence is always incomplete and often misleading. The religious worldview that shapes Sumerian life is complex, polytheistic in a way that makes Greek or Roman religion look almost simple by comparison, with hundreds of deities arranged in a cosmic hierarchy that mirrors the earthly hierarchy of kings, priests, and commoners. At the top sits Anu, the sky god, remote and powerful, who mostly stays in heaven and leaves the day-to-day management of creation to other gods. Enlil, the god of air and storms, is perhaps more important in practical terms, the executive to Anu's chairman of the board, and it's Enlil who makes most of the consequential decisions in Sumerian myth, including the decision to destroy humanity with a flood, which we'll get to later, but which suggests that even the gods have days when they regret their management decisions. Enki, god of water and wisdom, is the trickster figure, the clever problem solver who creates humans and then repeatedly saves them from Enlil's various attempts at genocide, which makes Enki either humanity's greatest patron or a middle manager who keeps undermining his boss's directives, depending on your interpretation. Each major city has its own patron deity. Eridu belongs to Enki, Uruk to Inanna, and later Anu, Nippur to Enlil, Ur to Nanna. The moon god and the political relationships between cities are understood through the lens of relationships between their gods, so that when one city conquers another, it's not just a military victory, but a cosmic realignment, the conquering city's god asserting dominance over the conquered city's god, though the conquered god doesn't disappear but is incorporated into the pantheon at a lower rank, because the Mesopotamian religious imagination is fundamentally hierarchical and bureaucratic. Gods filling out requisition forms in triplicate before performing miracles. The temple isn't just a place of worship, but the literal house of the god, who resides there in the form of a cult statue that is bathed, dressed, fed and entertained daily by priests who perform these services with the same attention to ritual detail that they apply to recording grain distributions. Because in the Sumerian worldview, the gods need humans as much as humans need gods. Humans provide service and offerings, gods provide order and protection, and the whole system works as long as everyone fulfills their obligations, which is essentially a divine labor contract with very severe penalties for breach on either side. The great existential fear that haunts Sumerian literature is the collapse of this order, the return to chaos, the possibility that the gods might decide humanity is too noisy or too numerous or simply too annoying and wipe us out to start over with something quieter, which actually happens in the flood myth and nearly happens on several other occasions, suggesting that the Sumerians had a well-developed sense of cosmic precarity, an awareness that civilization is fragile and existence itself is conditional on maintaining the proper relationships with forces far beyond human control or comprehension. Now, as Section 1 draws to a close and you feel your eyelids growing heavier, your breathing slowing to match the rhythmic lapping of imaginary Euphrates water against imaginary mud banks, consider this. Whether the Anunnaki were gods or aliens or metaphors or misremembered kings or all of these things at once or none of them, the Sumerians who wrote these stories down were people fundamentally like us, trying to make sense of their existence, trying to explain where they came from and why they're here and what obligations they might have to forces greater than themselves, and the answers they arrived at, whether literally true or symbolically true or completely false but psychologically necessary, shaped one of history's first literate civilizations, gave us writing and cities and law codes and epic poetry and the 60-minute hour, which we still use, and beer, which we also still use, and the week, and the idea that kings rule by divine mandate, and the concept of original. sin, and flood myths that echo through every subsequent culture in the region, and the first recorded jokes, which involve beer and bodily functions and are not particularly sophisticated but are recognizably human in their desire to find humor in the mundane, to laugh in the face of an uncertain universe, to assert that joy and absurdity have their place alongside duty and reverence, which is perhaps the most human impulse of all and one that we share across the millennia with people who lived and died thousands of years before anyone reading this was born, and who nevertheless feel, in their words pressed into clay, immediate and recognizable and not so different from us after all, which is either comforting or terrifying depending on whether you view history as progress or merely as change, but which definitely suggests that whatever else they were, the Sumerians were human, fully and completely human, with all the creativity and cruelty, wisdom and foolishness, hope and despair that the term implies. And if their gods were aliens, well, those aliens chose to work with humans rather than robots, which suggests either that we have some quality worth preserving, or that even advanced extraterrestrial civilizations make questionable labor decisions. And on that note, as the last light fades from your mental reconstruction of ancient Uruk, and the sounds of the ancient city fade into the white noise of your fan or air conditioner or the ambient hum of modern life, let's pause and prepare to move deeper into the story, into the specific myths and tablets that tell us what the Sumerians believed about their origins, their purpose, and their relationship to the beings they called gods, who descended from heaven, ruled from the temples, and left us a legacy of texts that we're still arguing about 5,000 years later, which is either a testament to their enduring relevance or proof that academics will argue about anything given sufficient time and funding. But either way, it's time to drift from this general introduction into the specific stories, starting with creation itself, with how the world began and how humans came to be, according to the oldest stories ever written down. Stories that are simultaneously alien and familiar, ancient and immediate, dead and somehow still alive in the substrate of Western civilization, echoing through the Bible and the Quran and modern science fiction and conspiracy theories and everything in between, which we'll explore together in Section 2. But for now, just breathe, relax. Let the images of ancient Mesopotamia wash over you like the spring floods that brought both fertility and destruction to the land between the rivers, and rest. The creation of the world, according to Sumerian tablets, is not a single coherent narrative, but a collection of overlapping and sometimes contradictory accounts, which should surprise no one who has ever tried to get a consistent story out of any large group of people, let alone a civilization that spanned multiple cities over thousands of years, each with its own traditions, its own priests, its own political agendas, and its own favorite gods whose cosmological importance needed to be emphasized at the expense of other cities' favorite gods. The Enuma Elish, which means "when on high" from its opening words, is the most complete creation epic we have, though it's actually Babylonian rather than purely Sumerian, dating to around 1800 BCE, which makes it relatively late in Mesopotamian terms, a synthesis and revision of earlier Sumerian material filtered through Babylonian political concerns, specifically the need to elevate Marduk, Babylon's patron god, to the head of the pantheon, which he accomplishes by defeating the chaos goddess Tiamat in single combat, and then creating the world from her corpse, which is both metal as hell and a transparent metaphor for Babylon's political dominance over older Sumerian cities. Tiamat is the primordial saltwater, and her consort Apsu is the primordial freshwater, and in the beginning there is nothing but these two, mixing together in the space between heaven and earth, which haven't separated yet because heaven and earth don't exist yet, there being nothing to separate them with, and from this mingling of salt and fresh water, the first gods emerge, which is either a poetic description of the creative power of mixing or a literal account of spontaneous divine generation, depending on whether you're a mainstream scholar or someone who believes ancient texts should be read with maximum literalism, regardless of context or common sense. These first gods are noisy, constantly fighting and making a racket, which disturbs Apsu's sleep, and after tolerating this for as long as his patience allows, Apsu decides to destroy them, because apparently even primordial creator beings value a good night's sleep and are willing to commit deicide to achieve it. The younger gods, learning of Apsu's plan, understandably panic, but Enki, here called Ea in the Babylonian version, comes up with a solution. He puts Apsu into a magical sleep and kills him while he's unconscious, which is both clever and deeply treacherous, establishing early on that the gods play by rules that would get them arrested in any modern legal system. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's murder, creates an army of monsters to avenge him, dragons and serpents and scorpion men, which sounds like the guest list for a progressive metal concert, and the younger gods are terrified because Tiamat is primordial chaos itself, the raw creative and destructive power of the universe given form, and they have no idea how to fight her until Marduk steps forward and says he'll do it, but only if they make him king of all the gods, which is a power move so brazen you have to admire it, even while recognizing it as the narrative justification for Babylon's imperial ambitions. Marduk defeats Tiamat by capturing her in a net, filling her with wind until she inflates like a cosmic balloon, and then shooting an arrow into her distended body which splits her in half, and from one half he makes the sky, and from the other half he makes the earth, and from various bits of her body he creates the clouds and mountains and rivers, which is recycling on a scale that would make modern environmentalists weep with envy if it weren't also graphic divine violence. The mainstream historical interpretation of this myth is that it's a political document dressed in religious language, a way of justifying Babylon's supremacy over older Sumerian cities by having Babylon's god defeat the primordial chaos and reorganize creation, with the not-so-subtle implication that challenging Babylon's authority is tantamount to siding with chaos against order, which is propaganda so effective it's been copied by every empire since. The bit about creating the world from Tiamat's body is understood as a personification of natural processes, specifically the separation of sky and earth, the establishment of boundaries between different realms, fresh water and salt water, day and night, order and chaos, which any civilization needs to function, and the violence of the myth reflects the violence inherent in forcing structure onto an inherently chaotic universe, the necessary coercion required to make anything stable or predictable or safe. The scholarly consensus, delivered with the weary patience of people who have explained this many times before and will explain it many times again, is that ancient people were perfectly capable of using metaphor and symbol, that they didn't necessarily believe their myths happened literally in the way a modern person might watch a documentary and believe it's an accurate representation of events, but rather understood them as true in a deeper sense, as explanations for why the world is the way it is, why there are seasons and storms and suffering, why humans must work and die while gods are immortal, why civilization requires hierarchy and authority and constant maintenance lest it collapse back into the chaos from which it emerged. The fringe interpretation, which I'm obligated to mention because I promised you quirky alternative theories and because some of you are only here for the aliens, suggests that the battle between Marduk and Tiamat is actually a description of a cosmic catastrophe, possibly a planetary collision in our solar system's distant past, with Tiamat being not a goddess, but an actual planet that occupied the space where the asteroid belt is now, and Marduk being either another planet or a large celestial body that collided with Tiamat, splitting it in half and sending one piece into its current orbit as Earth while the other piece became the asteroid belt, which would explain why the asteroid belt exists and why Earth's water might have come from cometary impacts if you're willing to completely ignore everything astronomers know about planetary formation and orbital mechanics. This interpretation requires you to believe that the Sumerians somehow knew about planetary collisions billions of years ago, that they encoded this knowledge in mythological form, and that modern science is only now catching up to what ancient people knew all along, which is a narrative that appeals to people who are suspicious of academic authority and excited by the idea that ancient wisdom surpasses modern science, but which falls apart under even cursory examination because the details don't match. The chronology is wrong, the mechanisms are impossible, and the evidence simply isn't there, except in the most generous possible reading of texts that are almost certainly not talking about astronomy at all. The specific claim that Tiamat was a planet comes from Sitchin again, who read Tiamat and decided it must refer to a planetary body rather than a deity, despite the fact that the text explicitly describes her as a goddess who births monsters and makes conscious decisions, which are not typically behaviors associated with inanimate celestial objects, and who is killed by another god using weapons and tactics that make sense for divine combat, but would be absurd in the context of planetary physics. The idea of the hammered bracelet, which Sitchin identifies as the asteroid belt, comes from a phrase in the Enuma Elish that mainstream translators render as something about the firmament or the heavens being beaten out like metal, which is standard ancient Near Eastern cosmological language, describing the sky as a solid dome, which is how ancient people understood the structure of the universe, and which has nothing to do with asteroids or planetary collisions and everything to do with observing the sky and trying to explain what holds up the blue dome and what the stars are attached to. The scholarly debate over how to read these creation myths productively has been going on for as long as there have been scholars reading these myths, which is roughly 150 years give or take, and the positions break down along predictable lines. Literalists who believe ancient texts should be taken at face value versus contextualists who insist that understanding requires placing the texts within their cultural and historical framework versus comparative mythologists who see patterns across cultures and argue for universal human concerns versus skeptics who question whether we can really know what these texts meant to their original audiences given how much cultural context we've lost. The most productive approach, which has emerged gradually through the work of people like Thorkild Jacobson and Jeremy Black, and others whose names you've never heard but who devoted their careers to actually reading Sumerian and Akkadian rather than speculating about them from a distance, is to recognize that Mesopotamian myths operate on multiple levels simultaneously. Their entertaining stories, their theological statements, their political propaganda, their attempts to explain natural phenomena, their meditations on the human condition, and they're none of these things exclusively, but all of them at once, layered and complex and resistant to simplistic interpretation. When a text says that humans were created to serve the gods, we can understand this as a literal statement about the purpose of human existence, a metaphorical description of the relationship between rulers and ruled, an explanation for why life involves so much labor and suffering, a justification for the temple economy where people work to support the priesthood, a theological claim about the nature of divinity and humanity, or some combination of all of the above, and which reading you privilege depends on what question you're asking and what evidence you're using and what assumptions you're bringing to the text. The debate gets particularly heated when it comes to the flood narratives, which appear in multiple Mesopotamian texts, with varying details but consistent core elements. The gods decide to destroy humanity. One god warns a favored human. The human builds a boat and survives with his family and various animals. The flood destroys everything else. The boat lands on a mountain. The survivor makes offerings to the gods, and the gods regret their decision and promise not to do it again, or at least not to do it the same way. The similarities to the biblical flood are obvious and were recognized as soon as the Mesopotamian versions were translated in the 19th century, causing considerable consternation among people who had assumed the biblical account was unique and divinely inspired rather than part of a regional storytelling tradition that the Israelites participated in and adapted to their own monotheistic theology. The sensory experience of life in Sumer after creation, after the world has been organized and humans have been made and cities have been built, settles into rhythms dictated by agriculture and astronomy, the two great timekeepers that govern pre-industrial life everywhere. The year divides into growing seasons and flood seasons, times of plenty and times of scarcity, and your entire existence is oriented around this cycle in a way that modern urban people, insulated from weather and able to buy strawberries in January, can barely comprehend. The spring floods arrive with terrifying power, the rivers swelling as snowmelt from distant mountains rushes downstream, overtopping banks, submerging fields, sometimes destroying buildings if the flood is particularly severe or the architecture particularly shoddy. This is both disaster and opportunity. Disaster because floods can kill and destroy. Opportunity because the floods deposit fresh silt across the fields, replenishing nutrients, making agriculture possible in a landscape that would otherwise become exhausted after a few seasons. The timing is crucial. Floods that come too early or too late can destroy crops. Floods that are too high or too low can cause famine, and this unpredictability is personified in the gods, particularly Enlil, whose moods govern the weather, and who must be appeased through proper ritual and offerings, lest he decide that humans are too annoying and deserve another cleansing flood. The actual experience of the flood is recorded in texts that describe people fleeing to higher ground, which in Sumer means fleeing to the temple platforms and ziggurats, the only structures tall enough to offer refuge, watching as the waters rise and consume houses and granaries and everything they've built, understanding this as divine punishment even as they recognize it as natural disaster, the two interpretations not contradictory in a worldview where nature and divinity are inseparable, where every thunderstorm is Enlil's voice and every gentle rain is divine favor. The account of human creation in Sumerian myth is, if anything, even less flattering to human dignity than the version in Genesis, where at least humans are made in God's image and given dominion over creation. In the Sumerian version, specifically in the Atrahasis epic, the gods create humans because they're tired of doing their own work, specifically the back-breaking labor of digging irrigation canals, and they create humans by mixing clay with the blood of a slain god, usually identified as Geshtu-e or We'ila depending on the version, who is sacrificed specifically for this purpose, his divine blood providing the intelligence and perhaps the troublesome tendency toward rebellion that will characterize humanity going forward. The gods, or rather Enki and the mother goddess Ninmah, create humans through a process that involves molding clay and reciting incantations, and the first humans are created in batches, like pottery, with Ninmah pinching off pieces of clay and Enki animating them with divine essence. And there's a wonderful scene where Ninmah gets drunk on beer and starts making defective humans, blind, lame, infertile. And Enki has to figure out social roles for these imperfect creations, which is either an early myth explaining disability or a cautionary tale about drinking on the job, possibly both. The mainstream interpretation is that this myth reflects the social reality of Sumerian society, where most people spend most of their lives doing agricultural labor to support a small elite of priests, scribes, and nobility who live in relative comfort, and the myth justifies this arrangement by saying it's divinely ordained. Humans were literally created to serve, and questioning the system is questioning the god's design, which is dangerous. The detail about using a slain god's blood is interpreted as explaining where human intelligence comes from. We have divine essence mixed with earthly clay, which makes us clever enough to farm and build, but not clever enough to be gods ourselves, occupying an intermediate position between the purely material and the purely divine, which is a decent description of the human condition if you think about it metaphysically rather than literally. The fringe interpretation of human creation focuses heavily on the genetic engineering angle, with Sitchin and his followers arguing that the mixture of clay and divine blood is a metaphorical description of genetic manipulation, the clay being the indigenous hominid DNA and the divine blood being Anunnaki DNA, with Enki playing the role of head geneticist, overseeing experiments that eventually produce Homo sapiens as a hybrid species, intelligent enough to mine gold and follow instructions, but not intelligent enough to build spacecraft or challenge the Anunnaki's authority. This interpretation points to the various failed attempts described in some versions of the myth: humans who are too strong or too weak, too intelligent or too stupid, infertile or overly fertile, as evidence of trial and error in genetic engineering, successive iterations trying to get the mix right, and eventually succeeding with the creation of modern humans who have been laboring for the Anunnaki ever since, unknowingly serving masters who masquerade as gods but are really just technologically advanced extraterrestrials exploiting Earth's resources. The evidence cited for this interpretation includes the sudden appearance of Homo sapiens in the fossil record, which actually isn't that sudden if you understand how fossils form and how rare they are, the genetic bottleneck in human populations suggested by mitochondrial DNA, which can be explained by various population dynamics and doesn't require alien intervention, and the persistent myths across cultures about gods creating humans or teaching humans civilization, which is easily explained by independent mythological development addressing universal human questions about origins and purpose without requiring any literal truth to the stories. The joke here, number 40 or so depending on how generously we're counting, is that the ancient astronaut theory requires you to believe that the Anunnaki had mastered interstellar travel, genetic engineering and long-term planning, but were somehow unable to automate gold mining or synthesize the materials they needed, and instead decided that creating an entire sentient species to do manual labor was the most efficient solution to their atmospheric problems, which suggests either a remarkable commitment to the long game or a failure of imagination that should disqualify them from being considered advanced in any meaningful sense. The purpose of humanity, according to the Atrahasis, is explicit and unflattering. We exist to serve the gods, specifically to do the agricultural and construction work that the gods themselves were doing until they got tired of it and staged a revolt. The text describes how the lower-ranking gods, the Igigi, were forced to dig the Tigris and Euphrates rivers by the higher-ranking gods, specifically Enlil, and after 40 years of this labor, and isn't it interesting that 40 keeps appearing as a significant number in Mesopotamian and later biblical texts, 40 years, 40 days, 40 nights, suggesting some symbolic rather than literal meaning. The Igigi rebel, surrounding Enlil's house with torches and threatening to burn it down unless something changes. Enlil is terrified and calls for Anu and Enki, and they have a divine management meeting to discuss what to do about the labor shortage now that the workers are unionized and threatening direct action, which is absolutely a metaphor for class conflict in Sumerian society, and possibly the first recorded instance of the ruling class scrambling to address labor unrest before it becomes revolution. Enki, always the clever one, suggests creating humanity to take over the work, which solves the immediate crisis and presumably makes the Igigi happy because they can now retire to whatever gods do when they're not digging rivers, though the text is vague on this point, possibly because the scribes writing this down recognized the parallel to their own situation and didn't want to push the metaphor too far. Humans, once created, multiply rapidly, which was the point, but they also become noisy, which annoys Enlil, who apparently has the divine equivalent of misophonia and cannot tolerate the sound of human cities and celebrations and general existence. After trying several methods to reduce the human population, plague, famine, drought, none of which work because Enki keeps helping humans survive, Enlil finally decides on the nuclear option, so to speak, and sends a flood to wipe out humanity entirely, which is either the action of a god who has lost all patience or the action of a deity who represents natural disaster and whose mythology reflects the very real danger that floods pose to Mesopotamian civilization. The flood narrative in the Atrahasis is paralleled by the flood narrative in the Gilgamesh epic, where the flood survivor is Utnapishtim, who tells his story to Gilgamesh as an explanation for why he alone among humans has been granted immortality. The story is also told in a standalone text about Ziusudra, who is the Sumerian version of the flood hero, predating the Akkadian Utnapishtim and Atrahasis, and the details vary but the core is consistent. Enki, unwilling to see humanity destroyed, warns his favored human by speaking to the wall of his house, telling the wall to build a boat while the human happens to overhear, which is either a clever loophole that allows Enki to obey the letter of Enlil's command not to warn any humans while violating its spirit, or a narrative device to explain how secret information gets transmitted, or possibly evidence that the Sumerians understood plausible deniability millennia before it became standard practice in modern politics. The boat is described in remarkable detail in some versions, its dimensions, its construction, the materials used, the method of waterproofing, all specified with a precision that suggests either genuine boat-building knowledge or verisimilitude for its own sake, making the story feel real through accumulation of concrete detail. Utnapishtim loads the boat with his family, various craftsmen and their families, and animals, though the number and type of animals varies by version, and when the flood comes, it's described in language so vivid you can almost feel the terror. The storm raging for 6 days and 7 nights, the world returning to chaos, the gods themselves frightened by the destruction they've unleashed and cowering like dogs, which is a simile that appears in the text and which humanizes the gods in a way that's both endearing and disturbing, suggesting that even divine beings can make catastrophically bad decisions and then regret them when the consequences become clear. The mainstream scholarly consensus on the Mesopotamian flood narrative is that it probably reflects real flood events in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which being a floodplain experiences regular catastrophic flooding, and that these events were mythologized over time, becoming the Great Flood that destroyed the world, rather than the Great Flood that destroyed our particular city in our grandfather's time, which is how oral tradition works, amplifying and universalizing local events until they become cosmic. Archaeological evidence for massive flooding in the region exists, though whether any particular flood layer corresponds to the mythological flood is debatable and probably unanswerable. The biblical parallels are explained by cultural diffusion. The Israelites, during their Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, encountered these Mesopotamian flood narratives and adapted them to their own monotheistic framework, replacing the council of gods with a single god, and replacing the arbitrary divine decision to destroy humanity with a moral judgment about human wickedness, which changes the story's meaning significantly, from "the gods are capricious and sometimes regret their actions" to "God is just and humans are responsible for their own destruction," which is a different theological statement entirely. The question of whether there was a global flood is answered firmly in the negative by geology, which shows no evidence for worldwide inundation in human times, but the question of whether there were devastating local floods that wiped out early civilizations and left traumatic cultural memories is answered in the affirmative, and those memories, preserved through oral tradition and eventually written down, became the flood narratives we're discussing. The fringe interpretation of the flood narrative, because of course there is one, suggests that the flood was either a nuclear war between rival Anunnaki factions, with the descriptions of fire and wind and destruction being mushroom clouds and radiation and fallout, or an actual planetary catastrophe, possibly related to the orbit of Nibiru, causing gravitational disturbances that resulted in massive tidal waves and flooding. The evidence for this, such as it is, includes ancient texts from various cultures describing massive floods, which is explained much more simply by the fact that floods happen and are memorable. Vitrified forts and cities that show signs of extreme heat, which are usually explained by warfare or accidental fires but are reinterpreted as nuclear attacks, and anomalous radiation readings at certain archaeological sites, which are either contamination from modern sources or natural background radiation being misinterpreted by people who want to find evidence for their theories. The specific claim that the Anunnaki used nuclear weapons comes from interpreting references to divine fire and radiance as atomic explosions, which requires you to ignore the cultural context in which divine beings are routinely described as radiating light or fire as a sign of their holiness or power, and to assume that ancient people had no other way to describe bright lights or massive explosions except through direct observation of nuclear weapons, which is both condescending and unnecessary. The alternative explanation, that bright lights and loud noises and destruction can be experienced through volcanic eruptions, lightning strikes, meteors, and regular warfare involving fire, all of which would have been terrifying to ancient people and which they would naturally attribute to divine action, is simpler, requires fewer unfounded assumptions, and actually fits the evidence we have, which is why mainstream scholars prefer it. Not because they're dogmatic or closed-minded, but because they're applying Occam's razor and preferring explanations that don't require inventing invisible entities or technologies for which no independent evidence exists. The aftermath of the flood in the Mesopotamian narratives is almost as interesting as the flood itself, because it deals with the question of what happens next. How do the gods and humans re-establish their relationship after such betrayal and near annihilation? In the Atrahasis, when Utnapishtim's boat finally comes to rest on a mountain, Mount Nisir in some versions, which might be in the Zagros range, or might be symbolic, or might be a real place whose identity is now lost, he opens the boat and releases birds to test whether the waters have receded, first a dove which returns, then a swallow which also returns, and finally a raven which doesn't return, indicating that the waters have receded enough for life to resume. which is a detail that appears in the biblical account, and which might be practical boat wisdom preserved in mythological form, or might be pure narrative invention that happened to seem plausible. When Utnapishtim finally disembarks, he immediately makes offerings to the gods, slaughtering animals and burning them, and the gods, who have been starving because there are no humans to make offerings, smell the smoke and gather around like flies, which is an undignified simile that appears in the text and which suggests the gods' dependence on human worship, not the other way around. Enlil arrives furious that any humans survived, but Enki defends his decision to save them, arguing that destroying humanity entirely would have left the gods without servants, and eventually a compromise is reached. Humans will be allowed to continue existing, but death, disease, and infertility will limit their numbers so they don't become too noisy again, which is a grim explanation for human mortality. We die because the gods need us to exist but find us annoying at scale, but is at least more honest than many religious explanations that try to make death seem like a gift, or a natural completion rather than a limitation imposed from above. The detail about the gods starving without human offerings is significant because it reveals the reciprocal nature of the divine-human relationship in Mesopotamian thought. Gods need humans as much as humans need gods, which means the relationship is transactional rather than purely hierarchical, and humans have leverage theoretically, though in practice the gods have all the power and humans have only the power to withhold service, which the gods can punish with plague or flood or drought. This is different from later religious frameworks where God is self-sufficient and human worship is for humanity's benefit rather than God's need, and it's arguably more honest about how religious institutions actually function in society. Priests eat because worshippers bring offerings. Temples grow wealthy because people donate. Religious authority persists because people grant it. The myth simply personifies this relationship and projects it onto the cosmic level where gods themselves depend on the system continuing. The scholarly debate about how literally the Mesopotamians believed this is ongoing and probably unresolvable without access to their actual internal beliefs rather than the texts they produced, which might be sincere theological statements, or might be ritual scripts, or might be political propaganda, or might be all of these things for different people in different contexts. The assumption that everyone in a culture believes their culture's religious narratives in the same way, or to the same degree, is almost certainly false. Some people are always more devout, some more skeptical, some simply going through the motions, and this was probably as true in Sumer as it is today, which means the question, did the Sumerians really believe in the Anunnaki, is underspecified, because which Sumerians are we talking about, and what do we mean by believe, and in what context, public or private, ritual or personal, official or heretical? The gift of immortality to Utnapishtim, which occurs at the end of the flood narrative, is interesting because it's presented as exceptional and final. The gods grant him and his wife immortality as a reward for surviving and for preserving life through the flood, but they make clear this is a one-time thing. Nobody else gets this deal. Humanity in general remains mortal, and even Utnapishtim's immortality is passive and isolating. He's not young and vibrant forever, but simply doesn't die, living in a distant paradise at the edge of the world where Gilgamesh has to travel through supernatural danger just to find him. And when they meet, Utnapishtim is essentially telling Gilgamesh that immortality isn't what he thinks it is, that eternal life without eternal youth is its own kind of prison, and that humans should accept their mortality and find meaning in the life they have, rather than wasting that life seeking what cannot be obtained. This is sophisticated philosophical content dressed in mythological narrative, the kind of wisdom literature that addresses universal human concerns about death and meaning and the limits of human power, and whether it comes from gods or from human reflection on the human condition is less important than its enduring relevance. The fact that people 4,000 years later are still asking the same questions and still finding the same answers unsatisfying but necessary. The fringe interpretation, for completeness, suggests that Utnapishtim's immortality is evidence of genetic engineering or advanced medical technology that the Anunnaki could grant to favored humans, and that his isolation at the edge of the world is actually a quarantine or separate facility where these genetically modified humans were kept away from the general population to prevent contamination of the gene pool, which is creative but requires you to ignore the text's clear presentation of immortality as divine gift and exception rather than technology and standard procedure, and to retrofit ancient wisdom literature into a science fiction framework that it neither needs nor supports. As Section 2 draws to a close, feel your mind drifting through the floodwaters that cover the world, watching from the safety of a wooden boat as everything familiar disappears beneath the rising tide, knowing that this is both ending and beginning, destruction and renewal, the same ambiguity that characterizes all transformative experiences, whether they're mythological or personal, cosmic or intimate. The Sumerian flood narrative gives us a template for understanding catastrophe and survival, for making sense of how something precious can be almost lost and then preserved, how mistakes can be corrected though never perfectly, how the world can be washed clean but still carry forward the patterns and problems that existed before because humans remain human even after the flood, still serving the gods who tried to destroy them, still building cities that will eventually annoy Enlil all over again, still seeking meaning and immortality and knowledge, still pressing our stories into clay tablets that will outlast us by millennia, still trying to explain where we came from and why we're here and what obligations we might have to forces beyond our understanding or control. Whether those forces are gods or aliens or simply the impersonal processes of nature personified and projected onto the sky, the questions remain the same, and the answers we give shape our civilizations and ourselves in ways both subtle and profound, creating cultures that persist across centuries, ideas that echo across millennia, narratives that feel simultaneously ancient and immediate, dead and alive, foreign and familiar, which is the peculiar magic of Sumerian literature, its ability to speak across vast gulfs of time and culture to address concerns that haven't changed much despite all our technological progress and social development, because humans remain humans, vulnerable and mortal and creative and foolish, making the same mistakes and finding the same meanings that our ancestors found when they first pressed these words into clay, when they first told stories about gods who made us to serve them and then regretted it, who destroyed us and then saved us, who granted us intelligence enough to ask questions but not enough to answer them fully, leaving us to fumble forward through history, building and destroying, learning and forgetting, writing things down so that we might remember even as we acknowledge that memory itself is imperfect, that the past is always interpreted through the present, that every reading of these ancient texts is also a reading of ourselves, our concerns, our biases, our hopes and fears projected onto cuneiform wedges that can mean almost anything if we're creative enough or skeptical enough or desperate enough for answers that transcend the ordinary and the mundane. And on that note, as the waters recede and the boat settles on the mountain and the birds fly out to test the world's readiness for life again, let's pause and breathe and prepare to continue into Section 3, where we'll explore what happens after the flood, how civilization rebuilds, how the relationship between gods and humans develops through the ages of Sumerian history, how kings claim divine authority and cities compete for supremacy, all of it recorded in tablets that were meant to last forever, or at least until the next flood, whichever came first. But for now, just rest, floating in the dark waters of sleep, secure in your boat, trusting that morning will come and the world will emerge again, different but recognizable, ready for the next chapter, the next age, the next attempt to build something lasting from mud and reeds and human ambition. After the flood, the world begins again, though not from nothing. Utnapishtim and his wife survive. Various craftsmen and animals preserve the knowledge and biodiversity necessary for civilization to resume, and most importantly, the gods remember what happened last time they tried to solve their problems through mass extinction and decide to be slightly more moderate in their future interventions, which is character development of a sort, though not necessarily the kind that inspires confidence in divine decision-making abilities. The mainstream historical fact for this section centers on the Sumerian king list, one of the most frustrating and fascinating documents to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, a text that attempts to record every king who ruled the various Sumerian cities from the beginning of time, or more accurately, from when kingship descended from heaven, down to the period when the list was compiled, probably around 2000 BCE, though copies were made later, and the text itself draws on earlier traditions and king lists that are now lost. The king list divides history into two periods, before the flood and after the flood, with the antediluvian kings reigning for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years in some cases, while post-flood kings have more reasonable reign lengths that still strain credulity but are at least within the theoretical bounds of human lifespan if we're generous. The purpose of the king list is clearly political, establishing a continuous line of legitimate authority running from the gods down through history to the current ruler, whoever that happened to be when any particular copy was made, and it does this by presenting kingship as a single transferable commodity that moves from city to city rather than existing simultaneously in multiple places, which is propaganda designed to support claims of hegemony by whichever city controlled the narrative at any given time, though the reality on the ground was always more fragmented, with multiple cities claiming independent authority, and the king list's sequential structure being a useful fiction that imposed order on a messier political reality. The first king listed after the flood is Jusha of Kish, though some versions start with different names in different cities, reflecting the political biases of whichever scribal tradition produced that particular version. And from Kish, the kingship moves to Uruk, then to Ur, then back to Uruk, then to various other cities in a sequence that probably reflects actual shifts in political power, but compresses the timeline and eliminates simultaneity to create a narrative of continuous legitimate rule. The individual kings listed include some who appear in other texts and are probably historical. Gilgamesh, for instance, appears in the king list as the fifth king of Uruk's first dynasty, reigning for 126 years, which is obviously inflated, but his existence is generally accepted by scholars who note that his epic exploits are clearly legendary, while his basic historicity as a ruler of Uruk is plausible, and some who are probably completely mythical, including the early names that reign for thousands of years and accomplish supernatural feats that signal we're in the realm of mythology rather than history. The transition point where the king list becomes more historically reliable is debated, but generally scholars trust it more after about 2600 BCE, when reign lengths become more plausible and when we start to have independent archaeological evidence for some of the people and events mentioned. Though even then, it's wise to maintain skepticism because the king list was compiled long after the events it describes and draws on traditions that were already ancient and probably distorted by the time they were written down, which is the historian's perpetual lament. The sources are always compromised, the evidence always incomplete, the confidence always provisional. The quirky fringe interpretation of the antediluvian kings with their impossibly long reigns is, predictably, that these were actual historical figures who lived for tens of thousands of years because they were either Anunnaki themselves or human Anunnaki hybrids who inherited longevity from their divine parentage, and that their reigns represent actual historical periods that have been unfairly dismissed by mainstream archaeology as mythological because modern science refuses to accept that lifespan could have been radically different in the distant past. This interpretation draws support from the biblical patriarchs, who also live for hundreds of years in the early chapters of Genesis, Methuselah famously reaching 969 years, Noah living 950 years, Adam living 930 years, and suggests that both the Sumerian and biblical traditions are recording the same historical reality of extremely long-lived individuals in humanity's early period, possibly because the Anunnaki genetic engineering included longevity genes that became diluted over time as humans interbred and moved away from the original hybrid stock, or possibly because environmental conditions on Earth were different before the flood in ways that supported longer life. The specific mechanisms proposed vary wildly depending on which fringe theorist you're reading. Some suggest that Earth's atmosphere had higher oxygen content before the flood, supporting cellular repair and reducing aging. Some propose that the protective water canopy described in Genesis shielded Earth from cosmic radiation that causes DNA damage. Some claim that the Anunnaki provided medical treatments or technologies that prevented aging but were withdrawn after the flood as punishment for human rebellion. And some suggest that the long reign lengths are actually counting different units of time, months or seasons rather than years, though this creates its own problems because it would make some of these kings ascend to the throne as infants or rule for impossibly short periods if you do the math. The mainstream scholarly response to all of this is a weary sigh followed by an explanation that mythological inflation of numbers is a common feature across ancient literature, that kings often claimed divine ancestry and supernatural powers as part of their legitimating ideology, that the gradual decrease in lifespan from antediluvian kings to post-flood kings to historical kings represents the movement from pure myth toward historical reality, and that we have no biological, archaeological, or genetic evidence for humans ever living thousands of years or even multiple centuries in any period of our species' existence. The scholarly debate about how to interpret the king list productively has generated considerable literature, with the consensus being that it's a political document masquerading as historical record, useful for understanding how Mesopotamian cities conceived of authority and legitimacy, but requiring careful handling when trying to extract actual historical data from its claims. The antediluvian section is generally dismissed as pure mythology. The early post-flood section is treated with skepticism, but mined for possible kernels of historical truth embedded in legendary exaggeration, and the later sections are considered increasingly reliable as they approach the period when the document was compiled and when we have independent sources to check its claims against. The pattern of kingship moving from city to city is understood as reflecting real political history. Cities did rise and fall in prominence, with first Kish, then Uruk, then Ur, then Lagash dominating at different periods, but the sequential presentation obscures the reality that multiple cities often held power simultaneously and that the transfer of kingship was rarely as clean or uncontested as the king list implies, involving warfare, negotiation, marriage alliances, betrayal, and all the messy contingency that characterizes actual political history as opposed to idealized narratives of continuous legitimate authority. The value of the king list, then, is not primarily as a factual record of who ruled when, though it has some value for that purpose in its later sections, but as evidence of how Sumerians thought about political authority, divine legitimacy, and the relationship between heaven and earth, with kingship literally descending from heaven and kings serving as intermediaries between the divine and human realms, responsible for maintaining Mayat, or rather its Sumerian equivalent, which doesn't have a single word equivalent but involves concepts of order, justice, and proper relations, and accountable to both the gods above and the people below, at least in theory, though in practice the accountability to gods was enforced through priestly interpretation of divine will, and the accountability to people was enforced through occasional revolution when things got bad enough that the people decided the king had forfeited divine favor. Sensory details for life in this immediate post-flood period, or more accurately for life in the early dynastic period of Sumer around 2900 to 2350 BCE, which is when the cities listed in the king list actually flourished, include the smell of bitumen being used to waterproof the massive reed boats that travel up and down the rivers, carrying grain and textiles and pottery and metals and all the commodities that make urban civilization possible. Bitumen, which seeps naturally from the ground in certain locations in Mesopotamia, smells sharp and chemical, a petroleum smell because that's what it is, crude oil in solid form, and it's used not just for waterproofing but as a building material, mixed with reeds and sand to create a primitive concrete, and as an adhesive for inlays and decorative work. So its smell permeates the city, mingling with the more organic smells of cooking and livestock and human bodies and the river itself, which smells of mud and fish and vegetation, a living smell that changes with the seasons and the river's moods. The sound of this period would include more bronze work than earlier periods because bronze production has increased and spread, the ringing of hammers on metal, the hiss of hot bronze being quenched in water, the scraping of files smoothing rough edges, the whole industrial soundscape of a society that's discovered metallurgy and is exploiting it enthusiastically, making tools and weapons and decorative items, developing specialized craftsmen who do nothing but work metal, creating social stratification between those who control the metal supply and those who don't. The visual landscape is dominated by monumental architecture on an increasing scale, ziggurats growing taller with each generation as cities compete to build the most impressive temple platforms, palaces emerging as distinct structures separate from temples as kings assert authority, independent of priestly control, and city walls surrounding the urban core, massive fortifications made of mud brick, sometimes 15 or 20 feet thick and twice that tall, with gates decorated with glazed bricks and guardian figures, bronze-clad doors that can be barred against enemies, and watchtowers from which guards scan the horizon for approaching armies or raiders, or the dust clouds that signal danger. The political reality of this period is one of constant competition between city-states, each claiming supremacy, each ruled by a king who claims divine authority, each fielding an army and conducting diplomacy, and occasionally going to war when diplomacy fails or when opportunity presents itself. The warfare is brutal but relatively small-scale by later standards, armies numbering in the hundreds or low thousands rather than tens of thousands. Battles decided by formations of men with spears and shields, donkey-drawn chariots providing mobile platforms for archers or spear throwers, sieges conducted with ladders and battering rams against mud brick walls that can be undermined or simply worn down through patient assault. The most famous military innovation of this period is the phalanx, the Sumerian version appearing in artwork showing tight formations of soldiers with large shields forming a wall, spears projecting forward, moving as a unit, which requires discipline and training and suggests a level of military organization that goes beyond ad hoc militia and indicates professional, or at least semi-professional soldiers, which in turn indicates cities wealthy enough to support men who fight rather than farm, which indicates successful agricultural surplus extraction through taxation or tribute or temple estates worked by dependent labor. The joke here, thin as it is that the Sumerians invented warfare as we understand it, organized, systematic, conducted according to conventions and strategies, not because they were particularly violent, but because they were particularly organized, applying the same bureaucratic efficiency to killing each other that they applied to grain storage and tax collection, which is either depressing or impressive depending on your perspective and how much you value organizational capacity as a human achievement separate from the uses to which it's put. The relationship between kings and temples in this period is complex and varies by city and period, with some kings clearly subordinate to priestly authority, serving as the temple's military arm and legitimized through priestly recognition, while other kings assert independence or even superiority, claiming direct divine mandate without priestly intermediation, building their own palaces that rival the temples in size and grandeur, patronizing their own scribes and artists and craftsmen, creating parallel power structures that compete with the temple establishment. The city of Lagash provides well-documented examples of this tension, with inscriptions from rulers like Eannatum describing both his temple-building activities and his military conquests, and later rulers like Urukagina implementing reforms that curtail priestly power and redistribute temple lands, suggesting that by the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, the temples had accumulated enough wealth and control to generate political backlash from kings who saw their own authority undermined by religious institutions that claimed to speak for the gods, but which in practice looked a lot like a hereditary elite protecting their own economic interests. The reforms themselves are fascinating, recorded on clay cones and tablets that detail the abuses being corrected: high fees for temple services, confiscation of property, corruption among temple officials, widows and orphans being exploited by the powerful, all problems that sound remarkably modern and which suggest that human venality and institutional corruption are constants across history, present in the very first civilizations, and presumably present in whatever comes after our own civilization collapses, assuming pattern holds and assuming there's anyone left to record the complaints. The specific phrasing used in Urukagina's reforms, he freed the inhabitants of Lagash from usury, burdensome controls, hunger, theft, murder, and seizure of their property, sounds almost too good to be true and probably represents ideal rather than reality. Propaganda about what the king claims to have accomplished, rather than dispassionate assessment of what actually changed. But even propaganda is informative because it tells us what people valued, what they complained about, what they wanted rulers to address, which in Lagash around 2400 BCE, apparently included economic exploitation by religious authorities, which creates a certain cognitive dissonance if you've been taught to think of ancient religion as purely spiritual and otherworldly, rather than as an economic and political institution embedded in material reality and serving material interests alongside whatever spiritual functions it might also have performed. The relationship between Sumer and its neighbors grows more complex during the early dynastic period as trade networks expand and contact increases with other cultures developing along different trajectories. To the north, the Akkadians are emerging as a distinct culture, speaking a Semitic language unrelated to Sumerian, eventually growing powerful enough to conquer Sumer under Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BCE, which marks the end of Sumerian independence and the beginning of the Akkadian Empire, though Sumerian language and culture persist and influence the Akkadians profoundly, creating a hybrid Sumero-Akkadian civilization that synthesizes elements from both cultures. To the east, Elam develops as a rival civilization with its own traditions and political structures, occasionally allying with Sumerian cities against other Sumerian cities in the complicated chess game of Mesopotamian politics, and occasionally invading to take advantage of Sumerian weakness or internal conflict. To the west, various semi-nomadic groups move through the Syrian desert and Levant, some settling and forming their own towns and kingdoms, some remaining pastoral and providing both trade goods and military threats to settled civilizations. The eternal tension between nomad and settler, mobility and permanence, which plays out across Mesopotamian history and which gets mythologized in various ways, including possibly the Cain and Abel story where the farmer kills the shepherd or vice versa depending on which version you read, but the underlying tension between different lifestyles and economic strategies is clear. Trade goods flowing into Sumer include copper and tin for bronze, coming from Anatolia or Afghanistan, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan providing the brilliant blue stone prized for jewelry and inlay work, cedar wood from Lebanon because Mesopotamia has no native timber suitable for construction, and various exotic materials like carnelian and shells and precious stones that serve no practical purpose but which signal wealth and status and which aristocrats accumulate and display to differentiate themselves from commoners who wear wool and use pottery rather than having access to imported luxuries. The development of cylinder seals during this period represents a minor administrative innovation that turns into a major art form. Small stone cylinders carved with intricate designs that when rolled across wet clay produce a continuous frieze of imagery, used to seal jars and doors and tablets, marking them as authentic or authorized or belonging to a particular person or institution, and the imagery carved into these seals provides some of our best evidence for Sumerian religious iconography and daily life, because seal makers apparently had freedom to depict everything from formal religious scenes to moments of surprising intimacy or humor, including one famous seal showing what appears to be a couple in bed being served drinks by a servant, which is either a wedding scene or evidence that some aspects of human behavior have not changed in 5,000 years, or possibly both. The artistic style is distinctive, figures shown in profile with elaborate detail lavished on clothing and hair and jewelry, hierarchical scaling where important figures are larger than less important figures regardless of actual physical relationships, and a horror vacui, a fear of empty space, that results in every available surface being filled with decoration, patterns, symbols, cuneiform inscriptions, everything crowded together in a dense visual field that modern minimalists would find overwhelming, but which Sumerian aesthetics apparently valued as indicating richness and completeness rather than clutter. The materials used for seals range from soft stones like limestone or serpentine that could be carved with bronze tools, to harder stones like lapis lazuli or quartz that required more specialized cutting techniques, possibly using drills with abrasive powders, and the smallest seals are masterpieces of miniaturization, depicting entire mythological scenes in spaces the size of your thumbnail, with detail visible only under magnification, which raises questions about how they were made and and who could actually see the detail when examining the seal itself rather than its impression in clay, suggesting either that the makers had better eyesight than we give them credit for, or that the process of making the seal involved techniques we don't fully understand, or simply that artisans took pride in work that exceeded practical necessity, because excellence for its own sake is also a human constant across time. The fringe interpretation of Sumerian cylinder seals focuses on the occasional imagery that seems to show astronomical scenes or symbols that might represent planets or cosmic events, with some seals allegedly showing all 12 planets of the solar system including Nibiru, though mainstream archaeologists point out that the specific seal in question actually shows a star surrounded by other celestial bodies that are almost certainly other stars or possibly symbolic representations of deities rather than an accurate scale model of the solar system as it would appear from space. The argument that ancient Sumerians knew about Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, which weren't discovered until 1781, 1846, and 1930 respectively, requires either alien information transfer or telescopes, and since we have no evidence of ancient Mesopotamian telescopes, and indeed the lens-grinding technology required to make telescopes didn't exist until the medieval period at earliest, we're back to aliens, with the alternative explanation being that what looks like planets to modern eyes, primed to see planets, is actually symbolic imagery representing something completely different, possibly deities, possibly stars, possibly just decorative elements with no astronomical significance whatsoever. The scholarly debate on this is less a debate than an eye roll, with mainstream archaeologists generally refusing to engage seriously with claims that require us to ignore everything we know about ancient astronomy and attribute knowledge to the Sumerians that they show no evidence of possessing in their actual astronomical texts, which do exist and which show a sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles and planetary movements for the planets visible to the naked eye, but which nowhere suggest knowledge of the outer planets or of the solar system's structure as understood by modern astronomy. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed during this period or possibly slightly earlier and revised and added to over centuries, represents Sumerian literature at its finest, a meditation on mortality and friendship and the limits of human power disguised as an adventure story about a king who goes on a quest for immortality after his best friend dies. Gilgamesh, introduced as 2/3 god and 1/3 man, which is mathematically confusing but mythologically significant, rules Uruk with such vigor and excess that his people complain to the gods, who create Enkidu, a wild man raised by animals, to be Gilgamesh's equal and challenger, and after they fight to a draw they become inseparable friends and go on adventures together, killing monsters and defying gods and generally behaving like Bronze Age action heroes until the gods decide they've gone too far and punish them by killing Enkidu, which breaks Gilgamesh and sends him on his quest to find Utnapishtim and learn the secret of immortality, which he ultimately fails to achieve, learning instead that immortality is not available to humans and that wisdom consists of accepting this limit and finding meaning within it, which is a profoundly sophisticated message for what could have been a simple adventure narrative. The mainstream interpretation treats the epic as literature, as a work that explores universal human themes through specific cultural imagery and analyzes how it reflects Sumerian values and concerns, the importance of friendship and loyalty, the tension between civilization and nature represented in Enkidu's transformation from wild man to city dweller, the proper relationship between humans and gods which involves respect but not slavish obedience, and the inevitability of death which must be accepted rather than fled from if one is to live well. The fringe interpretation suggests that Gilgamesh's quest for immortality reflects actual knowledge of life extension technologies possessed by the Anunnaki, that Utnapishtim represents a human who successfully accessed these technologies and achieved physical immortality, and that the epic records Gilgamesh's failure to obtain this technology despite his semi-divine parentage, possibly because the Anunnaki had decided to restrict access after the flood, or because the specific combination of genetics and treatment required for immortality was no longer available in Gilgamesh's time. The plant of eternal youth that Gilgamesh finds at the bottom of the ocean, only to lose it to a snake who steals it while he's bathing, is interpreted either as a metaphor for genetic therapy or as a literal description of a botanical source of life extension compounds, and the snake stealing it is either a literal event or symbolic of knowledge being lost or restricted by serpent-associated deities, which connects to the Garden of Eden narrative, where a serpent also features prominently in a story about humans losing access to something precious, suggesting to fringe theorists that both narratives record the same historical event from different perspectives. The mainstream response is that serpents appear in mythologies worldwide because they're dramatic, dangerous, mysterious animals that shed their skin and thus seem to be reborn, making them natural symbols for transformation and renewal, and that finding parallels between different mythologies doesn't require them to be describing the same historical events any more than finding that multiple cultures independently developed pottery means they all got the idea from the same source. Parallel development and universal human concerns can generate similar stories without requiring literal historical connection. The sensory experience of hearing the Epic of Gilgamesh performed in its original context would be communal and ritualistic, probably accompanied by music, with a trained bard or priest reciting from memory or reading from tablets, the audience gathered in a courtyard or temple precinct, the story unfolding over multiple evenings because it's long and complex and meant to be savored rather than rushed through. The language would be formal, elevated, full of epithets and repeated phrases that serve both mnemonic and aesthetic functions, creating a rhythmic quality that makes the story easier to remember and more pleasurable to hear. The repetitions building expectation and satisfaction as familiar phrases recur in new contexts, the whole thing operating on multiple levels simultaneously as entertainment and education and religious instruction and political propaganda and philosophical meditation and whatever else listeners wanted to take from it. The emotional impact centers on Enkidu's death and Gilgamesh's grief, which is described with such visceral intensity, Gilgamesh refusing to believe his friend is dead, sitting with the body for 7 days until a maggot falls from the corpse's nose, at which point he can no longer deny the reality and breaks down completely, that it transcends cultural difference and speaks directly to anyone who has lost someone they loved and tried to deny it or bargain with it or rage against it before finally, reluctantly, accepting it, which is the human experience of grief described 4,000 years ago but feeling immediate and contemporary because grief itself hasn't changed. The particular circumstances and cultural expressions might vary, but the core emotional experience is universal. As Section 3 winds down and your mind drifts through ancient Uruk, walking its streets with Gilgamesh and Enkidu, watching them prepare for adventures that will end in tragedy, knowing how the story ends but unable to change it, feeling the inexorable pull of fate or narrative or divine will or whatever force moves these characters toward their destinies, consider that the Sumerians who created this story were using fiction to explore truth, using invented characters to examine real emotions, using impossible quests to illuminate actual human limitations, which is what literature does and has always done, and which the Sumerians apparently understood perfectly well, creating works that function simultaneously as entertainment and philosophy, as myth and psychology, as cultural artifact and universal human document. The king list might be propaganda, and the flood narrative might be mythologized memory, and the cylinder seals might be purely symbolic, but the Epic of Gilgamesh is something else, something that transcends its cultural moment and speaks across the millennia because it addresses questions that don't have historical answers. How do we face death? How do we cope with loss? What makes life meaningful when we know it ends? And the answers it offers are simultaneously culture-specific and universal, rooted in Sumerian cosmology but accessible to anyone who has ever loved and lost, anyone who has ever wanted more time, anyone who has ever raged against limits they cannot overcome and finally, painfully, learn to accept them and find meaning within them rather than in transcending them. Whether the gods were real or metaphorical, whether the Anunnaki were aliens or inventions, whether any of the historical details are accurate or completely fabricated, the emotional truth of the epic remains, as true now as when it was first pressed into clay, as relevant in our age as in theirs, which is the miracle of literature, its ability to preserve and transmit human experience across time, allowing us to feel what people felt thousands of years ago, to recognize ourselves in their struggles, to understand that underneath all the cultural difference and technological change, humans remain humans, still seeking, still striving, still failing, still finding meaning despite failure, still creating beauty and meaning from mud and reeds and words, still trying to make sense of existence through stories, which is perhaps the most fundamentally human activity of all, more basic than tool-making or language or agriculture, the need to impose narrative on chaos, to find pattern in randomness, to create meaning where none objectively exists, but where we desperately need it to exist if we're to continue living with purpose and hope in a universe that offers neither guarantees nor explanations, only possibilities and the freedom to choose which ones we pursue, which the Sumerians understood and encoded in their literature, which survives to remind us that we're part of a conversation that started 5,000 years ago and continues still, every time we tell stories, every time we seek meaning, every time we press our own marks into whatever medium we use to record our thoughts and feelings and attempts to make sense of it all, which is what I'm doing now and what you're experiencing as you drift off to sleep, becoming part of this ancient conversation, this eternal human project of understanding and meaning-making and storytelling. And on that note, as the images fade and sleep approaches and Section 3 concludes, prepare to move into Section 4, where we'll explore the empire that unified Sumer under Akkadian rule, the synthesis of cultures that resulted, and the eventual collapse that returned the region to fragmentation before the next great flowering of Mesopotamian civilization. But for now, rest, dream of ancient cities and impossible quests and friendships that transcend death at least in memory and story if not in fact, and let the words wash over you like the floodwaters receding, leaving behind fertile ground for new growth, new understanding, new connections across time. The Akkadian Empire, established by Sargon the Great around 2334 BCE, according to later Mesopotamian chronology, represents the first time someone managed to unify the fractious Sumerian city-states under a single ruler, creating what might be called the world's first true empire, or at least the first one we have reasonable documentation for, though as with everything else in ancient history, the claims need to be qualified and contextualized and understood as provisional, because our evidence is incomplete and our chronology uncertain and our sources biased toward portraying their own rulers as epoch-making figures whether they were or not. Sargon's origin story, recorded in texts that were written centuries after his death and which mix historical memory with legend and political propaganda, describes him as a foundling, born to a priestess mother who set him adrift in a reed basket on the river, where he was found and raised by a gardener, eventually rising to become cupbearer to the king of Kish before overthrowing him and conquering Sumer, which is a narrative arc so compelling it was apparently borrowed for Moses, whose basket in the river story follows the same pattern, suggesting either that this was an actual common practice for dealing with inconvenient babies, or that it was a standard literary trope for marking someone as destined for greatness, despite humble origins, the rags to riches story being apparently as popular in ancient Mesopotamia as it is in modern America. The historical Sargon probably wasn't a foundling and probably had more conventional elite origins, but the story serves important ideological purposes. It establishes him as self-made rather than inheriting his position. It suggests divine favor since he survived against odds, and it allows later rulers who claim descent from him to root their legitimacy in both divine selection and proven capability rather than merely in bloodline, which is sophisticated political theology that pre-adapts his legacy for propaganda purposes by later dynasties who want to claim connection to him without actually being related. The conquest itself is described in texts that credit Sargon with defeating Lugal-Zajazi of Uruk, who had himself recently unified several Sumerian cities and probably would be remembered as the great unifier if Sargon hadn't come along and defeated him, proving once again that history is written by winners and that being first doesn't matter nearly as much as being successful, which is a lesson that applies to everything from warfare to entrepreneurship to academic publication. Sargon's empire eventually extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, or so later texts claim, with trading networks reaching to the Indus Valley and Anatolia, creating an economic system on a scale never before attempted, requiring new administrative techniques, new methods of communication and control, new ways of managing diverse populations, speaking different languages, and worshipping different gods, and following different customs. The solution Sargon developed, or possibly inherited from Sumerian precedents and expanded, was a bureaucratic system based on loyalty to the king rather than to the city, with governors appointed from the center rather than local elites holding hereditary positions, and with the Akkadian language used as a lingua franca for administration even in Sumerian areas, which must have generated resentment among Sumerian speakers who saw their language being displaced from official use, though it continued in religious and literary contexts, creating a diglossic situation where Sumerian was prestigious for certain purposes while Akkadian was practical for others, both languages influencing each other through prolonged contact and creating the hybrid Sumero-Akkadian culture that characterized Mesopotamia for the next 2,000 years. The mainstream scholarly understanding of the Akkadian Empire emphasizes its unprecedented scale and the administrative innovations required to manage territory spanning what is now Iraq, Syria, and parts of Iran and Turkey, treating it as a genuine breakthrough in political organization that established patterns followed by later empires. Centralized bureaucracy, appointed governors, standing army, standardized systems of taxation and tribute, royal propaganda claiming universal dominion even when actual control was more limited. The empire's success depended on military force, obviously, but also on economic integration, with the capital at Akkad, whose location is still unknown despite extensive searching, which is one of archaeology's persistent embarrassments, having lost an entire imperial capital somewhere in central Iraq, serving as a hub for trade routes and redistributive economy that gave peripheral regions reason to remain connected to the center beyond mere fear of conquest. The artwork from this period, particularly the victory steles showing Sargon and his successors trampling enemies and receiving tribute from conquered peoples, establishes iconographic patterns that persist throughout Mesopotamian and later Near Eastern art. The king as warrior, the king as chosen of the gods, the king as bringer of order and prosperity, enemies depicted as defeated and humiliated, the whole visual program designed to project power and legitimacy to audiences both domestic and foreign, threatening enemies while reassuring subjects that they're on the winning side of history, which is propaganda but sophisticated propaganda that understands how imagery works on viewers and uses that understanding systematically. The fringe interpretation of Sargon's rise and the Akkadian Empire's sudden appearance suggests, predictably, that Sargon received help from the Anunnaki, possibly being of partial Anunnaki descent himself, which would explain his extraordinary success, and that his empire was established to serve Anunnaki interests, possibly consolidating gold production and transport, possibly creating a unified administrative system that would be easier for the Anunnaki to control than managing dozens of independent city-states, possibly as an experiment in large-scale human governance to see if humans could handle empire or would collapse into chaos without direct divine supervision. The evidence cited is primarily Sargon's own propaganda, which describes him as uniquely favored by the gods, and the empire's rapid expansion, which admittedly is impressive, but not so impressive that it requires supernatural explanation when we have perfectly good natural explanations available involving military organization, strategic timing, exploitation of Sumerian disunity, and probably a fair amount of luck, which always plays a larger role in historical outcomes than participants want to admit, because nobody likes to think their success or failure depended partly on random chance rather than being entirely earned or deserved. The specific claim that Akkad's unknown location is because it was destroyed by Anunnaki weapons when Sargon's successors displeased them appears nowhere in ancient texts, but is inferred from the fact that we can't find it, which is reasoning backwards from ignorance, and which ignores the more mundane explanation that cities in Mesopotamia were built of mud brick, rivers change course regularly in this region, and millennia of agriculture and urbanization have buried or destroyed countless sites, making it entirely unsurprising that we've lost track of some of them even when they were once very important. The scholarly debate about the Akkadian Empire centers less on whether it existed, it clearly did, and more on how effective it actually was at controlling the territory it claimed, how much of the surviving propaganda reflects reality versus aspiration, and what caused its eventual collapse around 2054 BCE after roughly 2 centuries of dominance, or at least claimed dominance, which in the grand scheme of empires is not particularly long, and suggests that the centrifugal forces pulling the empire apart were never fully overcome and eventually reasserted themselves when central control weakened. The immediate successors of Sargon, his sons Raimush and Manishtushu, and his grandson Naram-Sin, maintained and possibly expanded the empire, with Naram-Sin particularly notable for declaring himself divine, having himself portrayed with the horned crown that signified divinity, and generally pushing the boundaries of royal ideology beyond what even Sargon claimed, which worked while he was powerful enough to enforce his claims but created problems for his successors who inherited the divine pretensions without the military success to back them up, discovering that claiming to be a god is all well and good when you're winning, but becomes awkward when you start losing because it raises uncomfortable questions about divine power and favor that undermine rather than support legitimacy. The collapse of the empire is attributed in ancient texts to invasion by the Gutians, a mountain people from the Zagros who swept down and conquered the weakened Akkadian state, though modern scholars note that the timeline is murky and that internal rebellion and environmental crisis probably contributed as much as external invasion, with the Gutians possibly being less a cause of collapse than a symptom, moving into a power vacuum created by existing problems rather than creating the vacuum themselves, which is how barbarian invasions usually work in history. They succeed when civilizations are already failing for internal reasons and fail when civilizations are healthy and vigorous, suggesting that the actual causes of collapse are endogenous while the external attackers are opportunistic rather than causal. The environmental crisis that may have contributed to the Akkadian collapse is attested in both textual and archaeological evidence, with texts describing prolonged drought and famine, and soil samples showing a period of aridification around 2200 BCE that would have devastated the agricultural surplus on which the empire depended. The joke that kills empires is not conquering armies, but climate change has a grim relevance here, suggesting that even Bronze Age civilizations could be undermined by environmental factors beyond their control, that all the military might and administrative sophistication in the world doesn't matter if the crops fail and people starve, and the tax base evaporates, and the whole complex system that requires surplus to maintain comes crashing down when surplus disappears, which should be a cautionary tale for our own civilization facing its own climate crisis, but probably won't be because humans are remarkably bad at learning from history, preferring to believe that this time is different. Our technology is better, we're smarter than our ancestors, right up until the moment we discover we're not, and the same patterns that destroyed previous civilizations are busy destroying ours for the same fundamental reasons: our complexity and interconnection and dependence on stable, environmental conditions creating fragility that manifests as catastrophe when those conditions shift beyond the narrow parameters our systems are designed for. The sensory experience of living through the Akkadian Empire's collapse would be terrifying. The slow realization that things are not getting better, that each year is worse than the last, that the harvests keep failing and the granaries keep emptying, and the government keeps demanding taxes for an army that can't protect you from raiders or guarantee trade routes or maintain irrigation systems that are silting up and breaking down for lack of coordinated maintenance. The smell would shift from the usual urban funk of cooking and livestock and human waste to something more desperate: the acrid smoke of buildings burning during riots or raids, the sweet corruption of bodies not properly buried because there's no one to do it or nowhere to put them, the dusty dryness of drought, the air itself tasting of failure and fear. The sounds would be wrong too: less market chatter and more arguments, less music and more weeping, the absence of normal urban noise somehow more disturbing than the presence of unusual noise, the quiet that comes when workshops close and trade stops and people stop gathering in public spaces because it's not safe, or because there's no food to sell, or because the whole social fabric that makes urban life possible has started unraveling and everyone can feel it but nobody knows how to stop it. The visual landscape changes as buildings fall into disrepair, as walls develop cracks that nobody fixes, as decorative elements are stripped off for their material value, as squatters move into abandoned mansions and light fires that blacken the walls and damage the infrastructure, as the whole physical manifestation of civilization slowly degrades back toward the natural state of mud and reeds and river, the triumphant architecture of empire reverting to ruins that will be built over by whoever comes next, if anyone comes next, if civilization doesn't just end here and leave nothing but scattered villages and tribal groups and collective amnesia about the brief moment when humans built something grand and complex and magnificent and watched it all fall apart for lack of rain. The Gutian period that follows the Akkadian collapse is poorly documented and probably represents a reversion to more localized power structures, with various cities reasserting independence and the mountain peoples who invaded settling in some areas while being driven out of others, creating a confused political situation that later Sumerian texts characterize as chaos and foreign domination, but which archaeological evidence suggests might have been more stable than the texts claim. Possibly just different, possibly functioning fine for people at the time, even if later historians who valorized centralized kingship and Sumerian cultural dominance portrayed it as a dark age that needed to be overcome. The Sumerian Renaissance that eventually emerges, centered on the third dynasty of around 2112–2004 BCE, represents a conscious attempt to recreate or recover Sumerian culture and political power, with the the three kings portraying themselves as restoring ancient traditions and pushing back against foreign influence, speaking Sumerian, patronizing Sumerian literature, building in Sumerian architectural styles, creating a propaganda of cultural continuity, even as they're actually creating something new that draws on Sumerian heritage, but adapts it to contemporary circumstances in ways that would probably be unrecognizable to actual Sumerians from the early dynastic period. This pattern of renovation and innovation disguised as restoration appears repeatedly in history, with reformers and revolutionaries alike claiming to return to ancient wisdom or original principles while actually creating something novel, because humans are more comfortable with change when it's presented as recovery than when it's presented as innovation, tradition having more legitimacy than novelty, even when the tradition is invented and the novelty is beneficial, which tells us something about human psychology and its conservative bias toward the familiar over the new. Preferring the devil we know to the devil we don't, even when the devil we know is actually quite bad, and the new option might be better, but comes with uncertainty that we find more frightening than familiar suffering. The administrative texts from the III period are extraordinary in their detail and volume. Thousands upon thousands of tablets recording daily transactions, rations distributed to workers, offerings made to temples, goods received and dispatched, the whole overwhelming apparatus of a bureaucratic state that tracks everything and writes it all down, creating an archive that scholars describe with a mixture of awe and despair because it's simultaneously invaluable evidence for understanding ancient economy and society, and completely overwhelming in its sheer quantity, more information than any individual can process, requiring databases and statistical analysis and collaborative research to extract meaningful patterns from the avalanche of minutiae. The texts record things like 3 sheep received on the 5th day of the month, distributed as follows: 1 to the temple of Nana, 1 to the governor's household, 1 to the merchant's quarter, 2 liters of oil given to the metal workers for lubricating tools, barley rations for 50 workers on canal maintenance, calculated by day and totaled by month, beer allotments for temple singers, dates provided to messengers carrying tablets to other cities, cloth issued to make uniforms for soldiers, every transaction recorded, every resource tracked, the whole economy made legible to the state through writing, which enables taxation and redistribution and control, but also creates opportunities for corruption and embezzlement, because any system complex enough to require detailed record-keeping is complex enough to game if you're clever and have access to the records and are willing to risk the severe punishments that ancient Mesopotamian law prescribed for official corruption, which were severe precisely because corruption was endemic. suggesting that human nature hasn't changed much and that bureaucracies in 2000 BCE faced the same challenges of ensuring compliance and preventing graft that bureaucracies face today. The law codes that emerged during this period, particularly the Code of Ur-Nammu, which predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by about 3 centuries, establish legal principles and precedents that influence Mesopotamian law for millennia and which eventually influence biblical law and through it Western legal tradition more broadly. The codes are formatted as conditional statements. If a man does X, then Y shall be the consequence, creating a systematic approach to justice that attempts to standardize punishments and remove arbitrariness, though in practice the law always applied differentially depending on social status, with different penalties for injuring a nobleman versus a commoner versus a slave, which is at least honest about social hierarchy even if it's not what we'd consider just. The specific provisions include familiar crimes like murder and theft and assault, but also regulations about economic transactions, marriage and divorce, property rights, irrigation disputes, and various other matters that a complex urban society needs to regulate if it's to function without constant violent conflict. The law code serving as a kind of operating manual for civilization, spelling out the rules that everyone needs to follow and the consequences for breaking them, which in theory creates predictability and stability, even if in practice enforcement is always uneven and justice often depends more on who you know and what you can afford than on what the law says, which again is a pattern that transcends time and culture and suggests something depressing about human social organization and its tendency toward inequality and favoritism regardless of stated ideals. The fringe interpretation of these law codes suggests they're based on even older codes given by the Anunnaki, possibly laws that the Anunnaki followed on their own planet and which they imposed on humans as part of the civilizing mission, with the specific provisions reflecting alien values and priorities that got filtered through human interpretation, but which preserve essential Anunnaki legal principles about property rights and social hierarchy and acceptable violence. The evidence for this is primarily that the codes seem sophisticated for their time, which is simultaneously a compliment to the Sumerians and an insult suggesting they couldn't have developed sophisticated legal thought on their own, and that similar legal principles appear in multiple cultures, which is more simply explained by humans everywhere facing similar social problems and developing similar solutions through convergent cultural evolution rather than all receiving the same laws from the same alien source. The mainstream scholarly response is that law codes develop because complex societies need them, that the Sumerian codes represent indigenous legal development responding to local conditions and drawing on accumulated practical experience with dispute resolution and community organization, and that the similarities between different codes reflect cultural diffusion, borrowing, and adaptation as later cultures took Sumerian legal concepts and modified them for their own circumstances, which is well-documented historical process that doesn't require any supernatural or extraterrestrial explanation. The scholarly debate about these law codes centers on how much they reflect actual legal practice versus royal propaganda about justice, with some scholars suggesting they're primarily ideological documents showing the king as lawgiver and protector of the weak rather than actual statutes that courts used when deciding cases, while others argue that they must have had some practical application or why bother creating and preserving them, with the truth probably somewhere in between, the codes serving multiple functions simultaneously as propaganda and as reference material and as statements of principles that might not be followed in every case but which established expectations and created grounds for appeal when actual practice deviated too far from stated ideals. The provisions protecting widows and orphans and the poor from exploitation appear in multiple codes and are emphasized heavily, which might mean that protecting these vulnerable groups was a genuine concern of the rulers who promulgated the codes, or might mean that these groups were being exploited systematically and the codes are performing concern while not actually changing much in practice, or might mean both things at once. the rulers genuinely wanting to protect the vulnerable, while also recognizing that being seen to protect the vulnerable enhances their legitimacy even if their protection is more theoretical than real, human motivation being complex and seldom reducible to simple categories like genuine or cynical, most actions involving mixtures of selfishness and altruism, ideology and pragmatism, sincere belief and instrumental manipulation, all tangled together in ways that make historical interpretation challenging and definitive conclusions elusive. As Section 4 winds down and your consciousness drifts through the bureaucratic halls of Ur-3 administration, watching scribes record endless transactions, hearing them mutter calculations, smelling the clay tablets drying in racks, feeling the weight of all this administration, all this organization, all this complexity that enables civilization and constrains it simultaneously, consider that the Akkadian Empire and its collapse, and the Sumerian Renaissance that followed, established patterns that would repeat throughout history, the cycle of unification and fragmentation, the rise and fall of empires, the interplay of environmental and political and economic factors that determines which societies thrive and which collapse, the tension between centralization and local autonomy, between tradition and innovation, between what we say we value and what our actions reveal we actually prioritize when values conflict with interests. The clay tablets recording sheep distributions and barley rations might seem mundane, but they represent humanity's first sustained attempt to make society legible, to transform the confusion of human interaction into systematic categories that can be recorded and analyzed and controlled, which is the foundation of every complex institution that follows, from corporations to governments to universities, all of them trying to organize human activity through rules and records and hierarchies, all of them creating efficiencies and opportunities while also creating rigidities and blind spots and new forms of oppression dressed up as rationalization, which the Sumerians inaugurated, and we continue, for better and worse, mostly both simultaneously, the benefits and costs distributed unequally, the whole edifice resting on surplus agriculture and specialized labor and, ultimately, on writing, the technology that makes everything else possible, that allows knowledge to accumulate across generations, that enables strangers to coordinate action, that creates history and literature and law and commerce and all the apparatus of civilization that we take for granted until it fails, and we rediscover how fragile it is, how dependent on conditions that can change, how vulnerable to disruption, which the Akkadians learned when the rains failed, and the Ur-3 kings learned when the Amorites and Elamites invaded, and which every subsequent civilization has learned in turn, the lesson never quite sticking, each generation believing themselves exceptional until they're not, and the cycle continues. And on that note, as Section 4 concludes and you drift deeper into sleep, prepare for Section 5, where we'll explore the final flowering of Sumerian culture, its absorption into Babylonian civilization, and the long, slow process by which Sumerian language died while Sumerian thought and literature and influence persisted for millennia, shaping cultures that had forgotten where the ideas came from but which carried them forward anyway, the inheritance we still live with whether we know it or not. The long denouement of Sumerian civilization, its gradual absorption into Babylonian culture and eventual disappearance as a living language and political entity, spans roughly 500 years from the fall of the Ur-3 dynasty around 2004 BCE to the point where Sumerian stopped being spoken as a native language, though exactly when this happened is debated because language death is a process rather than an event, with Sumerian persisting in religious and scholarly contexts for another 2,000 years after it ceased to be anyone's first language, becoming a bit like Latin in medieval Europe, a prestige language for learned discourse that everyone educated had to study but nobody spoke at home, frozen in amber while Akkadian and later Aramaic took over as living languages of daily communication and commerce and governance. The Ur-3 state collapsed under pressure from multiple directions, with Elamite invasion from the east and Amorite infiltration from the west, the last king Ibbi-Sin losing territory piece by piece until finally the capital itself fell, and he was taken captive to Elam, a humiliation that later texts portray as cosmic disaster, the gods abandoning Ur, the natural order inverting, chaos returning, though actually life probably continued with different people in charge and different languages being spoken officially, but the average farmer or artisan experiencing more continuity than rupture, the dramatic language of collapse being a perspective from the palace rather than the village, which is usually how it goes. Elites experiencing discontinuity while commoners experience modification, power structures changing while daily routines persist, which is why revolutions and conquests and dynastic changes that seem earth-shattering in historical accounts often left surprisingly little trace in the archaeological record of how ordinary people lived, suggesting that perhaps our historical narratives privilege elite experience and political change over the social and economic continuities that actually mattered more to most people. The mainstream scholarly understanding of this period emphasizes the gradual cultural and linguistic shift from Sumerian to Akkadian dominance, with Sumerian becoming a learned language required for religious and literary purposes while Akkadian became the language of daily use, creating a bilingual or diglossal society where education meant learning Sumerian texts and scribal tradition meant copying Sumerian literature and religious ritual meant reciting Sumerian prayers, but business and law and government and casual conversation happened in Akkadian. The scribal schools, the Adaba or tablet house, continued teaching Sumerian for another 1,000 years, young scribes memorizing lexical lists and mythological texts and model letters and mathematical exercises, all in Sumerian, the curriculum remarkably conservative with texts composed in the Ur-III period or earlier still being copied and studied in the Neo-Babylonian period 1,000 years later, which is roughly equivalent to modern students still memorizing Beowulf in Old English or the Iliad in Linear B, possible but requiring institutional commitment to preserving a dead language for cultural reasons that transcend practical utility. The joke among Assyriologists, delivered with varying degrees of bitterness depending on how recently they've had to explain their career choice to confused relatives, is that they spend years learning a language that nobody has spoken for 4,000 years in order to read economic texts about sheep, which is reductive but contains enough truth to sting, the actual reward being not the sheep receipts, but the occasional literary gem, the myth or hymn or wisdom text that justifies all the sheep receipts you had to read to find it. The joy of encountering human thought across the millennia and recognizing yourself in someone else's words, despite the vast gulfs of time and culture and technology that separate you. The Isin-Lhasa period that follows the Ur-III collapse sees multiple city-states competing for dominance, with the cities of Isin and Lhasa giving the period its name, though other cities like Uruk and Babylon and Eshnunna also fielded their own dynasties and made their own claims to hegemony, creating a political landscape that resembles the early dynastic period's fragmentation, but with everyone now speaking Akkadian primarily and claiming descent from or connection to the old Sumerian dynasties, using Sumerian cultural prestige to legitimize Akkadian political power, which is a pattern that repeats throughout history, conquerors adopting the culture of the conquered to legitimize their rule, Romans becoming Hellenized, Germanic kingdoms adopting Roman titles and institutions, the Mongols adopting Chinese administration, the benefits of cultural continuity outweighing the satisfaction of imposing your own culture when what you're trying to do is rule effectively rather than make a point. The literature produced during this period includes some of the finest Sumerian poetry ever composed, which is paradoxical since Sumerian was already becoming a dead language, but makes sense if you understand that the people composing this literature were educated scribes who had devoted years to mastering Sumerian and who used that mastery to create new works in the classical style, the way medieval monks composed new Latin texts or Renaissance humanists wrote Neo-Latin poetry, the dead language offering prestige and tradition and connection to the past that living languages, however practical, couldn't provide. The specific texts that come from this period include the so-called lamentation literature, long poems mourning the destruction of various cities, particularly the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, which describes the fall of Ur to the Elamites in vivid, heartbreaking detail, the goddess Ningal pleading with the gods to spare her city, the gods refusing, The destruction proceeding despite everyone knowing it's wrong and unjust, but being unable to stop it because the decree has gone forth, and even gods must obey fate or the will of the assembly of gods, or whatever force governs divine decision-making in Mesopotamian theology, which is murky and possibly inconsistent, suggesting that Sumerian theologians hadn't worked out all the details, or that different traditions had different answers, or that the question of divine sovereignty versus divine plurality was as thorny in ancient Mesopotamia as it is in any polytheistic system where you have multiple gods with different agendas and need some way to resolve conflicts and create coherent narratives about who's in charge and who must obey whom. The sensory details in the lamentation are precise and devastating. The smell of smoke and burning flesh, the sound of people weeping and buildings collapsing, the sight of corpses piled in the streets and blood running in the canals, the taste of dust and fear, the tactile experience of fleeing with whatever you can carry while your world burns behind you. Everything you built or inherited or thought was permanent revealed as fragile and temporary and subject to forces beyond your control, which is trauma rendered as literature, the survivors processing their experience through poetry, which is what humans do, turning pain into art, catastrophe into narrative, meaningless suffering into meaningful testimony that says, "This happened, we were here, our city was beautiful and is now destroyed, and we will remember even if nobody else does." The fringe interpretation of the city lamentations suggests they're describing nuclear warfare, with the fire and destruction being atomic bombs dropped by warring Anunnaki factions, the survivors describing radiation sickness when they talk about skin falling off and hair dropping out and people dying mysteriously after escaping the initial destruction, the gods' inability to prevent the destruction being their unwillingness to intervene in Anunnaki civil war, or perhaps their actual powerlessness in the face of superior Anunnaki technology. The evidence cited includes the vivid descriptions of fire and wind and poison in the air, which could be nuclear blasts and fallout, and the fact that the destruction is presented as inevitable and decreed in advance, which could mean that the Anunnaki had announced their intention to attack and the local gods couldn't or wouldn't protect their cities. The mainstream scholarly response is that ancient warfare was plenty destructive without nuclear weapons, that cities burned when conquered because they were made of flammable materials and attacking armies used fire as a weapon, that plague and disease followed warfare because sanitation broke down and corpses weren't buried and water supplies were contaminated, that the vivid sensory descriptions reflect actual observation of actual destruction caused by actual Bronze Age warfare supplemented with literary embellishment to emphasize the catastrophe's magnitude, and that reading these texts as descriptions of nuclear war requires ignoring their cultural context and importing modern technology into ancient texts in ways that the texts themselves don't support and that create more interpretive problems than they solve. The scholarly debate about the lamentation literature centers on its function. Was it actually performed in religious rituals, possibly as annual commemorations, of the destruction, keeping the memory alive and perhaps attempting to prevent future destructions through ritual propitiation of the gods? Or was it primarily literary, texts for reading and copying in scribal schools, teaching history and theology and literary composition through emotionally powerful examples? Or was it therapeutic, survivors processing trauma through structured narrative that made sense of senseless violence by attributing it to divine will rather than acknowledging the randomness and contingency that actually governs historical events, which is too terrifying to accept, so we create stories that impose pattern and meaning and inevitability even when none exists? The answer is probably all of the above for different people in different contexts, the texts being flexible enough to serve multiple purposes simultaneously, which is why they survived and were copied and studied for centuries after the events they describe, remaining relevant because they addressed perennial human concerns about suffering and injustice and the apparent indifference of cosmic forces to human well-being, which are concerns that transcend any particular historical moment and which find expression in religious and literary texts across cultures and throughout history. The rise of Babylon as the dominant power in Mesopotamia occurs gradually during this period, with Hammurabi of Babylon ruling from 1792–1750 BCE, finally unifying the region through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering, creating what historians call the Old Babylonian Empire, though it probably didn't seem old at the time, just seemed like the normal state of affairs. Empires always presenting themselves as eternal and natural while actually being recent and fragile and dependent on specific conditions that can and will change. Hammurabi is most famous for his law code, the Code of Hammurabi, which is better preserved and more complete than earlier Sumerian codes, and which became paradigmatic for Mesopotamian law, though it draws heavily on those earlier Sumerian precedents, demonstrating the cultural continuity underlying political change. Babylonian civilization, being Sumerian civilization, continued under different management, the language shifting but the institutions and ideas persisting with modifications. The code itself is inscribed on a black stone stele, now in the Louvre, showing Hammurabi receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, the visual program establishing divine authority for human legislation, the specific provisions covering everything from murder and theft to agricultural contracts and medical malpractice and building codes, creating a comprehensive legal framework that attempts to regulate most aspects of life in a complex urban society, and including the famous lex talionis provision, an eye for an eye, which sounds brutal to modern ears, but was actually a limitation on vengeance, establishing proportionality and preventing feuds from escalating beyond the original injury. The point being not that you must take an eye for an eye, but that you can't take more than an eye for an eye, which is restraint dressed as retribution. Civilization imposing limits on violence even while channeling and legitimizing certain forms of violence, which is what law does. Defining acceptable and unacceptable violence and empowering the state to enforce those definitions through its own monopoly on legitimate force. The Babylonian absorption of Sumerian culture creates a synthesis that persists for millennia, with Sumerian myths and epics being translated and adapted into Akkadian, sometimes with significant changes that reflect Babylonian rather than Sumerian concerns. The Enuma Elish promoting Marduk being an obvious example, but also subtler changes in emphasis and interpretation that modify the meaning while preserving the narrative structure, which is how cultural transmission works. Stories being retold with adjustments that make them relevant to new audiences, the core remaining recognizable while the details shift to accommodate new circumstances and values. The educational system continues teaching Sumerian, but as a dead language now, required for cultural literacy but not spoken outside the classroom, creating a class of scribes who were technically bilingual but where one of their languages was entirely literary and scholarly, never used for casual conversation, which must have felt strange, learning a language solely to read old texts, the way modern students learn ancient Greek or Sanskrit or biblical Hebrew, languages that open doors to important literature and history but which nobody speaks, the gap between written and spoken creating a special relationship to the text, more reverent and careful perhaps than with living languages where you can check your understanding against native speakers and where the language continues evolving and adapting. Dead languages being frozen at the moment of their death, preserved but static, which is both their limitation and their appeal, offering stability and continuity that living languages cannot provide because they're always changing, always being corrupted or enriched or simplified or complicated depending on your perspective and your investment in linguistic purity versus linguistic vitality. The sensory experience of studying in a Babylonian aduba would involve the smell of fresh clay, the tablets made daily for lessons and recycled when no longer needed, only exceptional work being baked and preserved, most tablets being smoothed and reused, which is why our evidence is biased toward finished literary works and long-term records, while ephemeral documents like letters or lesson tablets are underrepresented, surviving mostly when they were accidentally baked in fires or when they were in archives that happen to be preserved by catastrophe, which means our picture of ancient literacy and education is shaped by the accidents of preservation and is probably missing important categories of texts that existed but didn't survive. The sound would be the scratching of styluses on clay, the murmur of students reciting lessons, the occasional thwack of a teacher's rod on a student who was inattentive or disrespectful, corporal punishment being standard educational practice across ancient cultures and indeed most of human history until quite recently. The idea that you could educate without physical coercion being modern and still controversial in some quarters, suggesting that even our most basic assumptions about how to socialize children are culturally specific and historically contingent rather than universal truths, though whether hitting children is effective pedagogy is an empirical question that has been researched, and the answer is basically no, it's not. But that didn't stop thousands of years of teachers from trying, tradition often persisting long after its ineffectiveness is demonstrable because institutions are conservative and people teach the way they were taught, reproducing practices across generations even when better alternatives are available. The visual landscape of the school would be rows of students sitting on the ground or on low benches, tablets on their laps or on the floor in front of them, a teacher circulating to check work or sitting at the front reciting passages for students to copy. The walls bare except possibly for some stored tablets containing reference works or exemplars, the whole setting more utilitarian than decorative. Education being serious business not to be diluted with frivolity or comfort, the austerity possibly deliberate to toughen students and teach them discipline along with literacy, though possibly just reflecting the reality that educational funding was limited and spent on essential materials rather than amenities. The latest Sumerian literature, the texts composed in Sumerian during the Old Babylonian period when Sumerian was already a dead language, includes some remarkable meta-literary moments, texts that reference earlier texts or comment on the scribal tradition or make jokes about the process of learning Sumerian, the scribes who composed these works being conscious of working in a dead language and sometimes making that consciousness part of the text itself, the way modern authors writing in Latin or classical Chinese or some other dead language might acknowledge the artificiality of their enterprise while defending its value. One text describes a student's school day in humiliating detail, the boy arriving late, forgetting his lesson, being beaten multiple times for various infractions, his only joy being when he comes home and his father feeds him dinner. The whole thing either a realistic portrait of ancient education or a humorous exaggeration, possibly both, the humor depending on recognition of shared experience. Every student who ever read this text, probably nodding in recognition at the description of being beaten for not knowing your lesson, which creates a continuity of educational suffering across millennia, students separated by thousands of years united in the experience of being punished for insufficient mastery of material they didn't choose to study but which authorities insisted was important. The text ends with the father inviting the teacher home for dinner and giving him gifts, after which the teacher suddenly decides the student is brilliant and will go far, which is satire of the most pointed kind, suggesting that educational evaluation is influenced by parents' wealth and generosity more than students' actual ability, a critique that remains relevant 4,000 years later and which suggests that some aspects of human institutional behavior are remarkably resistant to change despite dramatic transformations in technology and social organization. The fringe interpretation of Sumerian educational texts suggests they're transmitting coded Anunnaki knowledge, with the mathematical tables and astronomical observations and chemical formulas hidden in apparently mundane lessons actually preserving advanced science that the Anunnaki wanted transmitted across generations, but which had to be encoded in innocuous-seeming educational material to avoid being suppressed by religious authorities who wanted to keep humanity ignorant, which is a fun conspiracy theory that invents both the advanced knowledge and the suppression campaign from whole cloth, the actual mathematical texts being impressive for their time but not containing anything that requires alien instruction, being perfectly comprehensible as human mathematical development through trial and error and observation, Babylonian mathematics being sophisticated in some areas like solving quadratic equations and calculating compound interest, but not showing knowledge of calculus or advanced algebra or anything that would require instruction beyond what humans could figure out themselves given time and motivation. The mainstream scholarly understanding is that educational texts are exactly what they appear to be, teaching materials for training scribes in the skills they needed to function in their profession, the curriculum being conservative because scribal culture valued tradition and because the texts had proven effective at teaching the necessary skills, the inclusion of Sumerian being about cultural prestige and professional identity rather than about transmitting secret knowledge, scribes defining themselves partly through their mastery of Sumerian the way medieval European scholars defined themselves through Latin or traditional Chinese scholars through classical Chinese, the dead language serving as a marker of education and elite status that separated the literate from the illiterate and created a class boundary that was difficult to cross without years of dedicated study, which was possibly the point, education serving as gatekeeping as much as enabling, controlling access to positions of authority by controlling access to literacy. The scholarly debate about Sumerian survival as a learned language centers on motivation. Why did Babylonian scribes continue teaching and using Sumerian for 2,000 years after it died as a spoken language? The practical explanation is that important religious and literary texts were in Sumerian and needed to be read and copied, so teaching Sumerian remained necessary for anyone entering the scribal profession. The cultural explanation is that Sumerian represented high culture and ancient wisdom, so mastering it provided prestige and legitimacy that Akkadian, however practical, couldn't match. The institutional explanation is that scribal schools were conservative institutions that reproduced their traditional curriculum across generations because that's what institutions do, change being difficult and risky while continuity being safe and legitimate. So once Sumerian was established in the curriculum, it stayed there through sheer institutional inertia even after the original practical justifications had disappeared. The real answer probably involves all of these factors, reinforcing each other, practical needs and cultural values and institutional conservatism all pushing in the same direction, creating a stable equilibrium where Sumerian remained part of education for as long as the cuneiform scribal tradition itself survived, which turned out to be until around the 1st century CE when cuneiform was finally displaced by alphabetic writing systems that were easier to learn and more adaptable to different languages, at which point both Sumerian and Akkadian disappeared from use, their texts becoming unreadable until modern scholars figured out how to decipher cuneiform in the 19th century and reconstructed the languages through painstaking comparison of bilingual inscriptions and patient detective work that took decades and involved numerous brilliant scholars, and which is still ongoing, our understanding of Sumerian improving every year as new texts are published and new lexical insights are gained and new grammatical patterns are identified, the language gradually coming back into focus after millennia of obscurity, which is remarkable when you think about it, a language that disappeared 2,000 years ago being recovered and understood well enough that we can read texts written 4,000 years ago and recognize the humanity in them, the same emotions and concerns and literary devices that we still use, the continuity of human expression across the millennia. As Section 5 winds down and you drift through the halls of abandoned temples where priests still recite prayers in a language nobody speaks, through scribal schools where students still copy texts nobody reads outside school, through the long, slow twilight of a civilization that is already fading even as it continues to influence everything that comes after, consider that cultural death is never complete, that ideas and stories and literary devices and legal principles and mathematical techniques and astronomical observations persist even when the culture that created them disappears, that Sumerian influence runs through Babylonian culture and Assyrian culture and Persian culture and Greek culture and Roman culture, and eventually into the European medieval tradition and the modern world. Invisible threads connecting us to people who lived 5,000 years ago and whose names we don't know but whose influence we still feel, whose stories we still tell though in translated and transformed versions, whose inventions we still use though we've forgotten where they came from, writing and cities and law and literature and school, and all the apparatus of civilization that we take as natural being Sumerian innovations, or at least Sumerian contributions, their gift to history, the legacy that survives them and which we inherit whether we know it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not, the deep past shaping the present in ways too fundamental to notice without conscious effort, which is what this whole narration has been about, making visible the connections between then and now, between them and us, between the first civilization and our own, which is probably not the last, but which will itself someday be ancient history, puzzled over by archaeologists trying to reconstruct our lives from fragmentary evidence, our texts preserved or lost according to accidents we can't predict, our meanings misunderstood or creatively reinterpreted by people who think they understand us but who see us through the lens of their own concerns and categories, which is what we do with the Sumerians, projecting onto them our own questions about origins and meaning and authority, finding in their texts what we bring to them, as much as what they contain, the interpretation being always a dialogue between past and present, never simple recovery of what was but always negotiation between what was and what is, what they meant and what we need, what they said, and what we hear. And on that note, as section 5 concludes and we prepare for the final section, the reflective conclusion and the gentle transition into complete sleep, let yourself feel the weight of all this history, all these millennia, all these people who lived and died and left traces that we piece together into narratives that may or may not capture what really happened but which serve our need for connection and continuity and meaning, and prepare for one last section, one last meditation on what all this means or might mean or could mean, before we finally let go and drift into darkness and silence and dreams. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through Sumerian clay and Akkadian cuneiform and Babylonian synthesis and the long slow disappearance of a civilization that paradoxically never fully disappeared because it gave us too much that proved too useful to abandon, its innovations and institutions and narratives persisting in transformed and often unrecognizable forms, but persisting nonetheless, which means that when you write your name you're using a technology they invented, when you measure time in 60-minute hours and 60-second minutes you're using their base 60 mathematical system, when you read creation myths or flood narratives or heroic quests you're encountering story structures they pioneered, when you consult law codes or attend school or organize in cities you're participating in institutional forms they developed, and whether you believe the Anunnaki were gods or aliens or metaphors or misremembered kings or pure literary inventions, the fact remains that the Sumerians created something profound and lasting, a leap forward in human organization and consciousness that enabled everything that came after, the transformation from prehistory to history occurring first in southern Mesopotamia, where the rivers met, and the marshes teemed with life and people discovered that if you controlled water, you could control food, and if you controlled food, you could support specialists, and if you supported specialists, they could invent writing. And once you had writing, you could accumulate knowledge across generations. And once you accumulated knowledge, you could build ziggurats and empires and literary traditions that outlasted them, the whole magnificent edifice of civilization rising from mud and reeds and human ambition, the ambition to be more than animals, to create permanence in an impermanent world, to leave marks that last beyond a single human lifetime, which the Sumerians accomplished spectacularly well, their marks still visible. 5,000 years later, their words still readable to anyone who learns cuneiform, their thoughts still recognizable to anyone who pays attention, the fundamental continuity of human consciousness bridging the millennia and making their concerns our concerns, their questions our questions, their attempts at answers still relevant even when we reject the specific answers they proposed, the fact that they asked the questions being what matters, the fact that they tried to make sense of existence through observation and reason and storytelling and ritual, all the tools humans have for creating meaning in a universe that offers none objectively, that simply is without caring what we make of it or what we need from it.
The scholarly consensus, insofar as there is one, treats Sumerian civilization as a crucial breakthrough in human development, the first complex society, the first literate culture, the foundation on which Near Eastern and eventually Western civilization built itself, acknowledging both the innovations and the problems, celebrating the achievements while remaining clear-eyed about the exploitation and hierarchy and violence that accompanied them, because civilization has always been a mixed blessing, enabling great things while requiring submission to authority and accepting inequality as natural or divinely ordained, the price of order being freedom, the price of security being conformity, the price of accumulation being labor extracted from those who produce but don't control, which the Sumerians understood perfectly well, if their own texts are any guide. The complaints about exploitation and calls for reform suggesting that people then as now recognized injustice even when they couldn't or wouldn't fundamentally restructure society to eliminate it. The same basic patterns of domination and resistance playing out in Sumer that play out everywhere civilization appears, suggesting that maybe civilization itself contains inherent contradictions that can be managed but never resolved, the benefits and costs being inseparable, the very things that enable complex culture, specialization, hierarchy, centralization, also enabling complex oppression, the surplus that supports scribes and artists, also supporting armies and bureaucracies, the writing that preserves literature, also tracking taxation, the monuments that inspire also requiring forced labor to build, every achievement casting shadows, every innovation creating new problems alongside solving old ones, which is the tragedy and comedy of human civilization. Our magnificent and terrible project of organizing ourselves into communities larger than personal acquaintance can sustain, requiring systems and institutions and authorities that we simultaneously need and resent, submit to and rebel against, create and destroy in endless cycles that the Sumerians began and we continue, though whether we'll leave as impressive a legacy is an open question. Our digital archives possibly less durable than their clay tablets, our knowledge possibly more fragile than theirs, because it depends on functioning infrastructure and compatible technology, rather than being directly readable from the storage medium, raising the uncomfortable possibility that future archaeologists might understand Sumerian better than they understand us, because our storage formats will be obsolete and unreadable, while their clay tablets remain clay tablets forever. Readable by anyone who learns the language regardless of what technology exists, which is a sobering thought about technological progress and its assumption of advancement being permanent and forward-looking being always beneficial, when in fact, durability and accessibility might matter more than capacity or efficiency for anything we actually want to preserve across the very long term. The deep time that makes civilizations contemporary with each other, even when separated by millennia. The fringe theories about ancient astronauts and Anunnaki genetic engineering and advanced lost technologies will persist as long as people find mainstream archaeology boring or unsatisfying or suspiciously tidy in its rejection of alternative explanations, the appeal of these theories being not their evidence, which is weak to non-existent, but their narrative, which is exciting and empowering and suggests that human history is bigger and stranger and more significant than academics acknowledge, that we're part of a cosmic drama rather than just another species muddling through on an insignificant planet in an unremarkable galaxy, that our origins are special and our potential unlimited. If only we could recover the knowledge that was lost or suppressed or hidden by elites who want to keep us ignorant and powerless, which is psychologically appealing even if factually unsupported. Meeting emotional needs that mainstream scholarship doesn't address because it's focused on evidence and methodology rather than meaning and significance, creating a vacuum that alternative theories fill, rightly or wrongly, adequately or inadequately. And while we can criticize the evidence and logic and methodology of these alternative theories, we should perhaps acknowledge that the questions they're trying to answer, why are we here, what is our purpose, are we alone, what is our potential, are legitimate questions that deserve answers, and that if mainstream scholarship only offers, these are not our questions to answer, we just study what happened. Then people will look elsewhere for answers, finding them in ancient astronauts or New Age spirituality or religious fundamentalism or political ideology or whatever framework promises certainty and meaning and significance in a world that seems increasingly chaotic and meaningless and indifferent to human concerns, which is perhaps the real legacy of Sumerian civilization, not the specific answers they gave, but the fact that they tried to give answers at all, that they insisted existence must mean something, and that human effort must serve purposes beyond mere survival, that there must be order and justice and significance, even if we have to create them ourselves, because the universe won't provide them, which is what religion and philosophy and science all attempt in different ways. The same basic project of meaning-making that the Sumerians began when they started writing things down and organizing their observations into systematic accounts of how the world works and how humans should live within it. The experience of drifting off to sleep while contemplating these ancient questions and partial answers and enduring mysteries creates a particular cognitive and emotional state. The rational mind relaxing its grip, the critical faculties dimming, allowing associations and images and half-thoughts to bubble up without being immediately judged or dismissed, which is perhaps how insight works. The conscious mind getting out of the way and letting the unconscious make connections that rational analysis would reject as unjustified or premature. The dream state being closer to mythological thinking than waking logic, not because dreams are prophetic or mystical, but because they operate by association and symbol rather than linear reasoning, which is how myths work too. Multiple meanings compressed into single images, contradictions coexisting without needing resolution, time becoming fluid, causation becoming circular, everything suggesting everything else in webs of significance. That analysis would dissolve, but which imagination and intuition can navigate, which is why bedtime is perfect for history. The approaching sleep allowing the past to become present, the dead to seem alive, the alien to feel familiar, the familiar to appear alien, all the boundaries softening, all the categories blurring, until Sumerian priests and Anunnaki gods and ancient astronauts and academic archaeologists and you yourself all exist simultaneously in the liminal space between waking and sleeping, between then and now, between knowing and imagining, between accepting the mainstream narrative and entertaining alternatives, between certainty and doubt, which is perhaps the most honest intellectual position available to us, acknowledging that we know some things and don't know other things, and aren't entirely sure what category various claims belong in, the evidence being always incomplete, the interpretations being always provisional, the confidence being always limited by the recognition that future discoveries might overturn current consensus, which has happened repeatedly in archaeology and will happen again. So maybe humility and uncertainty are appropriate attitudes toward the deep past. Maybe admitting that we're guessing based on fragments is more honest than pretending we know for sure. Maybe entertaining multiple possibilities simultaneously is better than committing prematurely to single explanations. Maybe the fringe theories are wrong in their specifics, but right to question orthodoxy. Maybe mainstream archaeology is right in its methods, but wrong to dismiss questions about meaning and significance as beyond its purview. Maybe everyone is partly right and partly wrong, and the truth, if there is such a thing, emerges from dialogue and debate and continued investigation rather than from any single authority or framework or interpretive community. And with that meditation on uncertainty and the limits of knowledge and the value of questions over answers, let me remind you one last time that if you've enjoyed this journey through Sumerian clay and Akkadian empires and Babylonian synthesis and scholarly debates and fringe theories and all the rest of it, if falling asleep to discussions of ancient Mesopotamia has become a small pleasure in your evening routine, if you found value in these meandering meditations on history and historiography and human meaning-making across the millennia, then perhaps you might consider subscribing to this channel, leaving a like on this video, sharing it with anyone who might similarly enjoy using ancient history as a sleep aid, though I recognize that's a very specific demographic, and you probably don't know many people who fit it, but on the off chance you do, please spread the word, because creating these lengthy narratives requires research and writing and recording and editing, and it's sustained by audience support and engagement, by people actually watching and appreciating and wanting more. So if that describes you, welcome, thank you. Please stick around for future episodes where we'll explore other ancient civilizations and historical mysteries and scholarly debates and fringe theories, always with the same commitment to accuracy where we have it, uncertainty where we don't, and the sarcastic humor that makes it all bearable. Because if we can't laugh at ourselves and our attempts to make sense of the past, and our tendency to project our own concerns onto ancient people, and our confidence in interpretations that future evidence might overturn, then we're taking ourselves too seriously, which is always a mistake, especially when discussing things that happened thousands of years ago, and which we know about only through fragmentary evidence that could mean almost anything, if we're creative enough, or desperate enough, or committed enough to our preferred interpretation. So now, as your breathing deepens and your thoughts scatter, and the images of ziggurats and clay tablets and reed boats and ancient cities fade into the general darkness behind your eyelids, as the voices of long-dead Sumerians reciting their myths and laws and lamentations merge with the white noise of your fan or the ambient sounds of your sleeping environment, as the whole complex edifice of Mesopotamian civilization collapses back into the undifferentiated potential of unconsciousness from which dreams will or will not emerge, remember that you've been on a journey tonight, traveling 5,000 years into the past, visiting the first cities, meeting the first writers, encountering the first great literature, wrestling with the first great questions that remain our questions still, and whether the Anunnaki were gods or aliens or literary inventions, whether Sumerian civilization emerged independently or received help from extraterrestrial benefactors, whether the mainstream scholarly consensus is correct or the fringe theories contain suppressed truths. The fact remains that you've spent time tonight thinking about origins and meaning and human civilization and its fragility and its persistence, and hopefully that's been worthwhile. Hopefully that's enriched your evening and given you something to think about as you drift off. Hopefully that's contributed in some small way to your own ongoing project of making sense of existence and finding your place in the long human story that stretches from the Sumerians to us and beyond, to whatever comes next. The story that we're all part of whether we realize it or not, whether we engage with it consciously or not. The inheritance we receive from the past and the legacy we'll leave to the future, which connects us across time to everyone who came before and everyone who will come after, making us simultaneous contemporaries of all humanity, past, present, and future, all of us trying to survive and thrive and create meaning and leave something lasting, all of us succeeding and failing in different ways and different degrees, all of us part of the same basic project that the Sumerians began when they pressed the first words into clay and began the long conversation that continues in these words you're hearing now as you fall asleep. The conversation between then and now, between them and us, between what was and what is and what might be. The conversation that never ends because each generation takes it up anew, adds their voice, passes it forward. The chain of transmission that makes us human, that connects us to our deep past and our possible future, that gives us context and perspective and humility and hope, that reminds us we're not the first to face these questions and we won't be the last, that others have struggled before us and others will struggle after us, and that despite all the differences in technology and social organization and specific circumstances, the fundamental human condition remains recognizable across the millennia. The same needs and fears and hopes and dreams animating people then and now, which is comforting in a strange way, suggesting that we're not alone, that we're part of something larger than ourselves, something that transcends individual lives and persists across generations, something worth preserving and contributing to and passing forward, which is perhaps what the Sumerians felt when they invented writing, the sense that their words would outlast them, that they could speak to the future, that they could achieve a kind of immortality through recorded thought, which they did, which they have, which proves them right, validates their effort, justifies their faith in the power of words and memory and transmission, and which might inspire us to similar efforts, similar faith, similar hope, that what we create and preserve and pass forward will matter to someone someday, will contribute to the ongoing conversation, will add to the accumulated wisdom and folly of humanity, will become part of the inheritance that future generations receive and interpret and use to make sense of their own existence, the cycle continuing, the conversation persisting, the human story unfolding, chapter after chapter, age after age, civilization after civilization, each adding their verse to the eternal poem that began in Sumer 5,000 years ago and continues tonight in your bedroom as you finally, completely, let go of consciousness and drift into sleep and dreams, your own internal myth, making beginning, your unconscious mind weaving its own narratives from the fragments of daily experience and ancient history and everything between, creating meaning in the darkness, finding patterns in chaos, telling stories that nobody else will hear, but which serve the same basic function that Sumerian myths served, making sense of existence, processing experience, integrating past and present and possible future into coherent narrative, which is what consciousness does, which is what humanity does, which is what you're doing right now as you sleep. The work continuing even in unconsciousness, the project of meaning-making never stopping, which is beautiful if you think about it. This relentless human need to understand and connect and create significance, this refusal to accept meaninglessness, this insistence that existence must matter even if we have to make it matter ourselves, which we do, which we always have, which we always will, which the Sumerians taught us 5,000 years ago when they first pressed words into clay and began this whole magnificent, impossible project of civilization, that we continue tonight as you sleep and dream and rest, and tomorrow wake to continue your own small part in the ongoing human story that started in Sumer and continues wherever humans think and speak and write and create and remember and pass forward to the next generation, who will do the same, the chain unbroken, the conversation ongoing, the story without end. And on that note, with gratitude for your attention and your time and your willingness to spend your evening falling asleep to discussions of ancient Mesopotamia, which is perhaps the strangest compliment anyone could pay this content, but which I genuinely appreciate because it means you've found value here. You've found something worth returning to. You've found a small corner of the internet where history and humor and bedtime meet, and where you can relax and learn and drift off peacefully, which was always the goal, which seems to be working, which makes all the research and writing and recording worthwhile. So thank you. Sleep well. Dream of ancient cities and impossible quests and gods who descend from heaven and humans, who press words into clay and all the magnificent, strange, beautiful, tragic, hopeful human story that connects us across the millennia. And remember when you wake tomorrow that you're part of something larger than yourself, something that began long before you and will continue long after you, something worth contributing to and preserving and passing forward. The human conversation that started in Sumer and continues in you, the story without end, the project without completion, the journey without final destination. And rest now, sleep now, dream now, knowing that you've traveled tonight through time and space and human imagination, and that tomorrow when you wake you'll carry something of that journey with you, some fragment of Sumerian wisdom or Akkadian ambition, or Babylonian synthesis, or scholarly caution, or fringe speculation, or all of these things mixed together into your own understanding, your own interpretation, your own contribution to the ongoing conversation that we all participate in, simply by being alive and conscious and thinking and remembering and imagining possibilities and trying to make sense of it all, which is enough, which is everything, which is the human condition in its entirety, and which we've explored together tonight as you drifted off to sleep. So rest now, completely, fully, without reservation or worry or concern. Just sleep, just dreams, just the peaceful darkness that receives us all eventually, and from which we emerge refreshed and ready to continue the journey, the conversation, the story, tomorrow.